Hello, friends. This is Darin Hayes of PigskinDispatch.com. Before we take you to your favorite Sports History Network show, just want to tell you a little bit about some merch that you can pick up that represents your favorite SHN podcast. So far, there's t-shirts, coffee mugs, and even books from some of the authors that do podcasts right here on SHN. Who could buy something better than that than have the history right from the gentleman that you hear talking about it? But we also are adding things each and every day. And where's that store, may you ask? Well, it's at SportsHistoryNetwork.com. Up at the top, there is the SHN merch button. Click on that. It'll take you right to the store, and you can be representing your favorite podcast and show the world that, hey, on the swag that I'm using, it's the headquarters of sports yesteryear, Sports History Network, and my favorite podcaster, the Sports History Network store. Shop there today.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
Hello, old sports, and welcome to the Hello, Old Sports podcast on the Sports History Network. I'm Dan Newman, joined as always by my co-host and brother, Andrew Newman, and it is time to kick off the 2022 Hello, Old Sports History Network in Memoriam special. For those of you who are unfamiliar, we have been doing this episode. This will be our third year now. It's usually 2, sometimes 3 episodes where we commemorate some of the major lives that were lost in the world of sports in the year that is coming to an end. You will hear the voices of many of our Sports History Network colleagues as we go through these 2 episodes in chronological order. So there's something to look forward to there as you hear the various hosts on the network pop in and out. But we'll start it off with just Andrew and I. And Andrew, how are you doing on this evening?
I'm well, Dan. This is obviously always our end of the year undertaking that's kind of spread out across a few different recording sessions and, scheduling around different guests and other people on the network who want to come on and speak. And then, not to be morbid, but as happens most years, we have the list and then start recording around mid-December, and a few people usually pass away between when we've started recording and the end of the year, who we have to sort of find time to add onto the list. So there's been a couple of those already. Hopefully there won't be many more, but recent history would indicate that we will probably have some folks who pass away around the holidays that we have to add in towards the end.
And in fact, this first person that we're going to talk about here was somebody who I think passed away sort of late, like almost on New Year's Eve, as the 31st became the 1st. And we had even had the conversation about whether we wanted to hop back on and do this person as the last entry of 2021. But I think we realized that he technically had passed away on early during the day of January 1st, 2022. So we held off on him until then. And so it's been a good year for the Sports History Network. We've done some good episodes. We've got a few, kind of getting ready to put out. December is going to be a very prolific month for us. We're going to put out a whole bunch of episodes because we've got a couple that are right at the end of the editing process. And by the time you hear this, hopefully some of those will have already dropped. So we'd like to thank you as well for being a fan. And Andrew, thanks for doing the show with me again for another year. And we really, going into year and calendar year, at least number 4 of the Sports History Network in a couple of weeks. And we're really having a good time doing this.
Yep. And we got some ideas for how we're going to start 2023. And, we'd always welcome suggestions. Usually we get a couple of those a year. And, it's always an ongoing process to come up with different stuff to discuss. So, we're always open for suggestions, and usually we will take them and make an episode out of them.
All right, so why don't we go ahead and kick it off, and I will get us started right on January the 1st of this year, and that is Dan Reeves, who was born in 1944 and died on January 1st. Reeves played 8 years as a running back for the Dallas Cowboys before embarking on a successful NFL coaching career that saw him lead 3 teams to the playoffs. His best years were with Denver in the 1980s when he coached the Broncos to 3 Super Bowls in 4 years, unfortunately losing all 3. Reeves is the winningest coach, not a member of the Pro Football Hall of Fame. And I believe he is a candidate on the basically the equivalent of the veterans ballot for the Pro Football Hall of Fame. So his Hall of Fame candidacy will be once again considered again this year for the 2023 induction. Obviously, he's being no longer with us, would not be there to get the honor. But, growing up, obviously we remember Dan Reeves well. He coached the Giants for what? 4 years, I think, 93 to 96.
And so that would be as a coach, right? They're not as a player.
No, I think he was a decent player, but I don't think that what he did as a player, like I said, he only played the 8 years. He did play a pretty significant role in the sort of early days of the Dallas Cowboys, a very much sort of a protege of Tom Landry. And let me just pull up his Reeves's playing stats here.
I'm looking. There was only 2 years that he ran for more than 200 yards, 66 and 67, receiving. 1966 and 1967 were really the only 2 years that statistically he had any kind of significant production. Now, maybe, I don't know if he was the greatest blocking halfback of all time. I can't pretend I know that, but it seems like, it would mostly be as a coach. The one thing I wanted to say, it's weird because the thing that I remember Dan Reeves most as is the least successful part of his career. So I don't want to make it just about that. He had a lot of success as a coach before the Giants, and he actually had some success after the Giants with the Falcons. He coached in another Super Bowl. He was there with the early days of Michael Vick when they kind of revolutionized not revolutionized, but sort of rapidly changed how offensive football was played. So yes, my immediate recollection of Dan Reeves is watching Dave Brown throw a lot of incomplete passes as the Giants went 6-10, but that's not a representative sample of what the guy's coaching career, to say nothing of his playing career, was.
And it's funny too, because I don't associate him with those Michael Vick teams. I associate him more with the late 90s when he came in the 14-2 year, the team that 14-2 Falcon team that beat the Vikings in the NFC Championship game in Minnesota. And that Viking team that was 15-1. Who was it? It was Gary Anderson that missed the field goal for the Vikings, correct?
Yes.
Because the Vikings had Gary Anderson and the Falcons had Morton Anderson, 2 all-time great two all-time great kickers, I should say. And the Falcons, who, even though at 14-2 were significant underdogs, won and went to that Super Bowl. And then they lost, ironically enough for Dan Reeves, they lost to Denver. I associate him more with those years, but yeah, he was with the Falcons, took 2002, took the Falcons to the playoffs, and that I think was one of Vic's best years, if I'm remembering correctly, in 2002. Let me
that was his breakout year. Yeah, that was the year that he really made a lot of those early highlight plays, and the Falcons got to the second round of the playoffs, and then the next year he got hurt, Reeves got fired, and he had a few more good years with Atlanta, but 2002 was really the year that made him a central figure in the NFL for a while.
And I don't know the story off the top of my head, but it's interesting that he would have gotten fired the year after taking them to the playoffs, winning a game in the playoffs, and then to get fired nonetheless. You kind of associated him with sort of a very kind of laconic approach. He wasn't really much of a yeller. You didn't think he was very much sort of in the mold of his mentor, Tom Landry. And Landry actually used Reeves as an assistant coach while Reeves was still an active player in the early 1970s. So Reeves has a championship ring with the 1971 Cowboys, the team that beat the Dolphins. by this point in his career, he was very much, this was his second to last year in the league. He only ran the ball 17 times for 79 yards and had a couple receptions. So he was long gone as far as his prime was concerned, but he was both an assistant coach and a player. So he does have a Super Bowl ring as a player with the Dallas Cowboys. His most famous moment as a player, or his sort of most well-known moment as a player, he threw a touchdown pass in the Ice Bowl in, I believe it was at the beginning of the fourth quarter. He threw a touchdown pass to Lance Rensel on a halfback option that put the Cowboys up 17-14. In the Ice Bowl, the Packers came out, took a 14-0 lead, and then it was 14-10 after that. And for a long period of the game, this game stood at 14-10. And in fact, let me pull up
the first play of the fourth quarter.
Let me pull up. So it was 17-21 was the final score. So in the Ice Bowl, Green Bay scores in the first quarter and then again in the second quarter, 2 touchdown passes from Bart Starr to Boyd Dowler. Cowboys get a couple of turnovers, including a fumble return for a touchdown, make it 14-10. And then for the rest of the second quarter and for all of the third quarter in this frigid, getting darker game atmosphere in the Ice Bowl, nobody's doing much of anything. And then, like you said, just to start the fourth quarter, Reeves on a halfback option throws a 50-yard touchdown pass to Lance Rensel, makes it 17-14. And everybody thought that was going to be the deciding score of the Ice Bowl until the very end of the game when Bart Starr sneaks it in from the 1-yard line. So you don't necessarily associate Dan Reeves with the Ice Bowl, but he played a really crucial role in one of the great games in NFL history.
Yeah. And then, he retires in the early 70s. He takes over in Denver in 81. He's actually the coach in Denver for 12 seasons. Yeah, from 81 to 92, he's the coach in Denver. They only have 2 losing seasons. One is in 82, which is the 9-game season. They go 2-7. And then in 1990, they went 5-11. But other than that, they were no worse than 8-8. We talked about how they made the 3 Super Bowls. And again, it's sort of a thing where, and we've talked about this with the Bills, and I don't know if we've talked about it with the 70s Vikings, but it's the truth with the 70s Vikings too. The footage that really, I don't want to say survives, but the footage that you see, I think we talked about this with the 85 Patriots was what we talked about.
Yeah.
The highlights you see is of them getting their butts kicked by the Giants in 86, by the Redskins the next year, and then especially in 89 when they 55-10 lose to the 49ers. So you don't see the clips from, I guess with 86, you do see a lot of, you see the drive, but you don't see a lot of clips of, do you know off the top of your head who they beat in the 89 AFC Championship game?
I think it might have actually been Cleveland again. No, was it Buffalo?
I think it was Cleveland again, but it's, you don't know who they beat in the divisional round. You know what I mean? And most of the time when people talk about those AFC Championship games, they talk about it in the lens of Cleveland. So my point is more, it unfortunately gets colored the run they had. They made 3 Super Bowls in 4 years. They're one of the only teams that's ever done that. Obviously, well, there's more than a few, but there's a handful. They lost them all, but it still was a long run of dominance. And he's one of the only guys to ever take 2 teams to the Super Bowl. And let's not underestimate what that 98 NFC Championship game was. That was one of the big, sort of memorable football moments, upsets in the last 30 years was that 98 NFC Championship game.
Who else has done it? Parcells, Holmgren.
Yeah, Parcells, Holmgren, Shula.
Shula's the other one, yeah.
I feel like there's at least one more that I'm not thinking of, but Andy Reid.
And Andy Reid. Yeah, that's another one. That's a good point. So, yeah, I think the fact that they got smacked so much in all 3 of those Super Bowls probably doesn't help with the legacy. And also, I had forgotten about this. He and Elway did not like each other much.
We forgot about Dick Vermeil too. Sorry,
Vermeil's another one. Yeah, just got into the
and John Fox. And we did this as a trivia question a few weeks ago, I think.
John Fox.
But anyway.
Oh, the Broncos.
Panthers, and then the Broncos, the one they got their butts kicked, in 13. Sorry, go ahead. About him and Elway and their relationship.
They didn't like each other. They got into it over play calling. They, even at the height sort of the team doing so well, they definitely did not see eye to eye quite a bit. There's one meeting where they're trying to bring peace between the two, tension over play calling, and Elway just looks at Reeves in a meeting and says, "I hate you more than I hate anybody in the world." So maybe not. He said, "I hate you more than any person on this planet." And this was Mike Shanahan who was the offensive coordinator, trying to bring some peace between the two. And Shanahan says, after Elway said that, I realized maybe it wasn't such a good idea. So Reeves leaves. There was a Sports Illustrated article, or a Sports Illustrated cover, I should say, that I had forgotten about. But then when I read about it, I remembered it. And it was the two of them. And it's Reeves saying, "Grow up," and Elway saying, "Good riddance." And it's like, like the split down the middle, showing the two of them had broken up. And that was when Reeves went to the Giants. And then was Reeves directly replaced by Mike Shanahan in Denver? I think he was, right?
That sounds right. Yeah, I don't know who it would have been in the middle. Or was it Wade? Was Phillips the coach in Denver for a while?
Let's look that up real quick here.
I feel like I remember Wade Phillips in between, maybe for 2 years, maybe 93 and 94. Yeah, Phillips was the head coach 93 and 94.
And then it went to then Shanahan took over 95 to 08. Yeah. Yeah, because didn't Shanahan went to Oakland, I think, or whatever the Raiders were at that point. Yeah. But yeah, so I think that his career would probably have a much stronger legacy if he had won at least one title, and especially if they'd not gotten blown out in every single Super Bowl that he brought them to. Plus, the Falcons got blown out. That was a really boring 98 Super Bowl with them in Atlanta. So that wasn't with them in Denver, I should say. So that wasn't a great Super Bowl either. So, winning as coach, it's not a member of the Hall of Fame. There's been definitely a trend towards letting some of these more, I don't want to say mediocre, but these coaches who won a lot but didn't necessarily win a lot of championships, or in his case, win any championships. I mean, whether it's Vermeil getting in last year, I think is the perfect example, or Cowher, who only ever won the one Super Bowl. So my guess is that Dan Reeves gets in as a coach into the Hall of Fame. And I do have to say that 1 year that he coached the Giants in 93 and last year for Sims and LT, that was a fun year. That was kind of there was a lot of misery that came in the ensuing 4 or 5 years, but that 1 year, that was a fun kind of rejuvenated Giants team coming out of the Ray Handley years.
Yeah, and he came in, he started bringing a bunch of Broncos in. People, were calling them the New York Broncos, guys like David Treadwell. But yeah, it was, unfortunately every year of the Reeves tenure, the Giants got worse to watch. I guess you could debate whether the 95 or 96 team was worse, but a lot of that wasn't his fault. The team was getting old. The game had kind of passed the front office by at that point, but it was just growing up. That's what I associated him with, and unfortunately, I think that's probably the thing he'd least like to be remembered for. So it was that era,
and he won't be other than among we Giant fans. So Dan Reeves, maybe not a great all-time great coach, but a very good coach, and one who I think will probably be in Canton one day.
And you got to respect the longevity.
Yeah, absolutely. I think like 27 seasons as an NFL head coach or something like that. Just crazy.
Mm-hmm.
So, all right. So we are on to our second honoree and our first guest, and we're going to talk about Don Maynard, who was born in 1935 and died on January 10th. A Hall of Fame wide receiver, Maynard was the first player to sign with the New York Titans, later the Jets, in 1960, and stayed with the team until his retirement in 1972. With the drafting of Joe Namath in 1965, Maynard embarked on a string of all-pro seasons and started for the Jets and coach Weeb Ewbank in their legendary Super Bowl III win over the Baltimore Colts. Interestingly enough, Maynard had also played against the Colts and Ewbank in the 1958 NFL Championship game as a member of the New York Giants. And we are pleased to have with us the president of the Professional Football Researchers Association, joined us last year to talk about a couple guys and is back again this year, George Bozeka. George, thanks so much for joining us, and thanks for doing this again.
Sure. Enjoyed it last year and look forward to it again this year.
So what stands out to you about Don Maynard? What is it? We growing up in New York, Giants fans, but kind of that 68 Jet team has a very sort of unique legacy in the mind of the New York sports fan. But as sort of a neutral observer, what is it that stands out about Don Maynard to you?
I think the fact that when he retired, he was the leading receiver in NFL history at that time. He retired with 633 receptions and over 11,000 yards receiving, 11,834, which basically led all of the NFL upon his retirement. He was number one in receptions, number one in receiving yards. He was second behind Don Hudson in touchdowns with 88. I think that's the thing that stands out to me is that just what a great receiver he was. And obviously you mentioned the tandem with him and Namath was one of the great, quarterback receiver tandems, of all time in the NFL and definitely of the 60s.
He was one of these guys who kind of got his start in the NFL, and he was perhaps his original sort of noteworthy was, I think, the very first the very first play of the 58 title game. He was who they kicked off to. And so he appears when you watch the video of that game, he's there. And then like a lot of these guys didn't go so well for him in the NFL. He gets cut. I think he was playing in the Canadian League or something for a year. And then when the AFL comes along, the number of available spots in professional football essentially doubles. And so he is the very first player taken by the New York Titans, later the Jets, as we said, and languishes for those first few years. And then finally Namath comes along, and the first conversation they have, Namath gets to his first training camp. He says, Maynard says to Namath, he says, I'm going to make you a better quarterback and you're going to make me a great receiver. We're going to have the timing down so good. You are going to be able to make it blindfolded. And they do. They lead the Jets to their only title in franchise history. And like you said, certainly surpassed by quite a few guys when, the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s as they progress. But he, at the time of his retirement, has got a Super Bowl ring. He's on his way to the Hall of Fame, and he is the leading receiver in the history of the NFL.
Yeah, he did. He had very humble beginnings. He came out of Texas, El Paso, drafted by the Giants in 57. The Giants had won the NFL championship in 56. So this was a great Giants team. You had, Gifford, you had, Kyle Rote, a number of, Hall of Famers on that team. And he was basically playing behind Gifford and Rote. And because of that, he was used as a return specialist. And as you said, sort of famously, he did play in the 1958 title game, the game that's quote unquote the greatest game ever played. But he was really, sort of almost a cameo type of appearance, but he was a return specialist for the Giants that year. As you said, he was cut by the Giants. He spent a year in the CFL with Hamilton, actually played in a Grey Cup game, the CFL championship. They lost. And then, as you said, he became, a member of the Titans. Sammy Baugh, then the great quarterback, was the Titans coach. And he remembered Maynard because Maynard had played against him when he coached, in college. He was impressed by Maynard then. And, albeit those first couple of years, the Titans weren't very good. Sonny Werblin then, sort of a sports impresario, bought the team, invested some money, realized that he needed somebody big to, fit that bill in New York. So he did pick up Joe Namath, signed him to that huge contract. And, that's really when things got started. But, Maynard wasn't unusual in that. There was a lot of guys that, just weren't making it in the NFL for whatever reason. They basically got new life when the AFL started, as you said. And Maynard was one of those guys who went on to have a Hall of Fame career. And it's just, just amazing. And yeah, he did play in two of the most significant games. He also played in the Super Bowl III, which the Jets, obviously won to, sort of solidify the AFL as a viable league against the NFL. Interestingly, though, he didn't catch a pass in that game. He was hurt, and he was basically used as a decoy. And they said he was an important decoy because early in the game, they sent him on a long pass, and they didn't complete the pass. But the point is that they knew Maynard was on the field, and the Colts had to deal with him. And that's basically because George Sauer actually had the better game as a receiver in that game, who was one of, Namath's other great receivers that he had. But Maynard was actually, just a decoy. Maynard actually had the great game in the AFL championship game that year against the Raiders. That's what he is more known for in that run to the Super Bowl.
6 catches for 118 yards and 2 touchdowns in that AFL title game. Immediately preceding Super Bowl III.
Right. Yeah. They played it at Chase Stadium. Raiders, who were quarterbacked by the Mad Bomber Daryle Lamonica and Namath, 2 gunslinger type quarterbacks. Neither one of them, as I recall, I don't think completed 50% of their pass that day. Chase Stadium was, famously windy that day. And actually, Maynard felt that he made the greatest catch of his career in that championship game. They were down late in the game, and Namath threw a long, they said about 50-yard pass to Maynard. And it was supposed to be to his outside shoulder, but the wind pushed it to his inside shoulder. So he had to adjust while the ball was in the air as the ball's, the wind's blowing the ball. He made the catch, went out on the 6-yard line. On first down from there, Namath ran a play action pass, hit Maynard for the game-winning touchdown. And Maynard always said that long pass that he caught from Namath, he felt was the greatest catch he made in his whole career.
Certainly would be hard to beat it from a stature standpoint. So
he remains to this day the all-time leader in Jets history in receiving yards. He's up by over 3,000 on Wesley Walker. He's the all-time leader in receptions, leads Wayne Corbett by about 50. And let me just see if I can pull up the touchdown numbers. And he's up by about 17 on Wesley Walker. And third place in that is also Corbett, and he's only got 41. So he remains, even now 50 years after his retirement, he remains far and away the leader in all of these categories. Now, the Jets have not had a lot of firepower in their passing game over the last 50 years. They've not had a lot of great receivers. They frankly haven't had a lot of great teams over the last since 1968, and certainly since guys like Maynard and Namath retired. But nonetheless, he is definitely worth noting and mentioning. He's one of five retired numbers in Jets history, alongside Joe Klecko, Curtis Martin, Dennis Byrd, a gentleman who was paralyzed, and of course Namath. So I think you go to Jet games even today, you still see a Maynard jersey, stray Maynard jersey, even here and there once in a while. So
I think it also comes at a time, his career sort of spans an era where the position was evolving, even in the sense of what it was called. You think of in the 50s, it was still an end, and in a lot of ways was they threw the ball, but it was certainly it was still very much a running game, and a receiver being a key focus of the offense were a little more few and far between. And then, the story you told when he first started playing with Namath, he, in that story, refers to himself as a receiver, which probably 10 years before that would not have been the name. And I think that just kind of shows, especially in the AFL, the sort of evolution where the passing game was not purely a second or third option when other things weren't working. You could use that as a focal point of an offense, and having a receiver like Maynard was a key cog in that wheel.
I think it was the thing that sort of made the AFL was they had so many great quarterbacks and so many great receivers that they did really, open it up. I remember the documentary about them calling it sort of, full color football, and it really was, and it was interesting. Weeb Ewbank coached the Colts and famously in the 58 title game and won. And he also coached the Jets in 68. And he had a great receiver of the Colts, Ray Berry. And he was once asked to compare Berry and Maynard, because with Maynard finishing at the top of the heap when he retired, Berry was right behind him. And he said, Berry was the type of guy that ran these great routes, caught the ball. That was it. He said with Maynard, he would catch the ball, and because of his speed, he would just break it. He was hard to bring down because he just had that great speed. It's funny because I grew up during that Jet era, and I remember the Super Bowl, but the one game I remember Maynard was sort of his last hurrah game in 72. the Jets played the Raiders on Monday Night Football. And that was when, I know we have Monday Night Football then, but it wasn't the same. It's not the same. Back then, it was the thing. You didn't have games on Sunday. You didn't have games on Saturday. Monday Night Football was a big deal back then. And the Raiders and the Jets played Namath and Lamonica again. And Namath threw for 403 yards that night because he basically didn't have a running attack. And that was actually the last game Namath played that year because he sat out the next week because they were out of the playoff picture. But it was really sort of Maynard's last hurrah with the Jets because that was his last season with them. He got 7 balls for 131 yards that night. And I just remember watching the game on TV and how Maynard just kept getting open for Namath. And the Raiders knew they were going to pass because that's all they had that night. But yet they kept completing pass after pass, and they ended up losing 24-16. But it was just an amazing game. John Madden always said the best quarterback that he played against was Joe Namath, and that just those two guys and watching them work, it was just amazing.
And it really was sort of a match made in heaven between the two, right from the first day. 2 Hall of Famers, 2 AFL and Super Bowl III champions, Joe Namath and Don Maynard. George will be back with us a little later in the episode. In fact, actually, probably will be the next episode, the way we're planning to divide it up. But George Bozeka, President, Professional Football Researchers Association, thanks so much for joining us, and we'll talk to you again later in the episode.
Thanks. Look forward to it.
All right. Well, you're back with just Andrew and me, and I think it's time to move to the ice hockey rink. And Andrew, do you want to introduce our next individual?
Certainly. Clark Gillies, born in 1954, passed away on January 21st. A member of the Hockey Hall of Fame, Gillies played 12 years with the New York Islanders and was part of what many consider to be the greatest NHL dynasty of all time that won 4 consecutive Stanley Cups from 1980 to 1983. Gillies was twice named an NHL All-Star. I editorialized a little with the greatest dynasty of all time.
Yes, you did.
The greatest 4-year run, 5-year run of all time, if you don't count the Canadiens stretch. But no, Gillies was one of the when you go to the Nassau Coliseum and for a long, or now I guess the UBS Arena, but when I remember going to the Nassau Coliseum when I was first in high school and seeing all the banners, and it was all pretty much guys from that era. And you'd look at the retired jerseys, and it was Potvin, Bossy, Trottier, Nystrom, Gillies. And Gillies was, one of the signature guys on that team. I have a book here on the 1980 New York Islanders, which was the first one that won the Cup. It's called Birth of a Dynasty. I have 2 different books called Birth of a Dynasty. Yes, this one's about the night. And we have mine's got a different cover. Dan just held up his cover. Mine's got the cover from right after the game-winning goal was scored. But, I was just looking through some of the pages the other day, and Gillies had a reputation. So in that year, that their second-round series against the Bruins, who, had been a really good team throughout the 70s and had a reputation as a very tough team, which a lot of teams had back then. There's a little section I'll read here. It talks about the pits were where the game gets down and dirty. There's no better way to describe game 2. Gillies had to know it was coming. Of course he did. In the series opener, he put a little something extra into a hit on Bruins star forward Rick Middleton, who throughout his career always had more goals than penalty minutes. He wasn't a tough guy. The Bruins were livid. And it just talks about this huge fight between Gillies and O'Reilly. And it just, this whole book sort of talks about Gillies as a guy who was, especially in a playoff series of which the Islanders played 20 in that 5-year period, was, he was a skilled player. He wasn't a goon, but he was a guy who would step up and do some of the dirty work, whether it was fighting or hard hitting, because you don't want to get some of your biggest scorers involved in that stuff and possibly get hurt or just be off the ice for 5 minutes.
He had a series of fights with Terry O'Reilly of the Bruins throughout that sort of era when they were playing each other and meeting in the playoffs. And you said they played 20 playoff series in 5 years?
Yeah, because they went to 5 straight Stanley Cups. They won 4 of them, and then they lost the 5th one in the finals to Edmonton. So 20 playoff series. Yeah,
He was part of what they called the Trio Grand with Mike Bossy and Brian Trottier. And ironically, 2 of those, Bossy and Gillies, both died this year. And we'll talk about Bossy in a little bit. He was, like you said, he was kind of the muscle guy, not a goon, but he was sort of, maybe not the classic idea of an enforcer, but that type of guy. And one of his teammates, Butch Goring, said, quote, "He made life easier for everyone who played with him. Trottier and Bossy could do what they wanted to do because they had the big guy on the wing." So, and he was one of these guys, I feel like everybody just seemed to really like him. His teammates liked him, yes. And just I think he was kind of around the team for most of his life, if I'm not mistaken.
And he had actually been the captain in the late 70s for a couple of years, and he relinquished it because he felt like the responsibilities were, just weighing too much on him, and he wasn't doing a good job either as a captain or as a player, and he relinquished it. But obviously shows that he was a guy who was respected within the locker room to A, be named captain, and then B, to give it up and have that not be an issue because he truly was doing it to put the team first.
So it's a tough year for the Islanders with a couple of these guys from the early 80s passing away, but an opportunity.
One last thing on Gillies. He made some headlines in 1980 when he got the cup for 24 hours.
I was just about to tell this story.
He let his dog eat from the Stanley Cup, and the quote was, "Why not? He's a good dog."
Well, as a dog owner, I can endorse and support that. So Clark Gillies.
Have you ever let Thumper eat from the Stanley Cup?
If I ever were to get from the Stanley Cup, I would absolutely allow Thumper to eat from it whenever he wanted. So
tremendous.
All right, so Clark Gillies, and we'll be back, and we'll touch on one of his Islander teammates later on in the show. All right, so moving on, and let's talk about Bill Fitch, who was born in 1932 and died on February 2nd. Fitch coached 25 years in the NBA for 5 different teams, leading each to the playoffs at least once. His greatest successes came with the Boston Celtics, who he led to an NBA championship over the Houston Rockets in 1981. 5 years later, Fitch was on the other side of the court, leading the Rockets against the Celtics in the '86 NBA Finals. In 1997, Fitch was named one of the 10 greatest coaches in NBA history. We are lucky enough to have yet another guest. We have another Sports History Network host on with us, Rick Loayza, who hosts Basketball History 101 on the Sports History Network, is joining us to talk about Bill Fitch, and you'll hear from him again later on to talk about another gentleman. But Rick, it's good to see you, and thanks so much for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me. I really appreciate being part of what you're doing here for the end of the year, honoring those that we've lost in 2022. It's just happy to be helping be a part of it.
And we appreciate it. This is, I think, our largest endeavor. We Andrew and I started 2 years ago, and we first did this in 2020. And I think I was able to get a couple guys to jump on for a little while to talk, and we're up to 6 this year. And we're actually, Andrew and I, kind of, our schedules didn't match up, and so we haven't always been able to do everybody together, but we were able to get you're the last one we're recording, and we're able to get all 6 guys on with both of us. So this has been really fun. This has kind of become like the flagship of what we do every year, and it's kind of our big contribution to the Sports History Network. So Bill Fitch, this is an interesting guy, and I think Andrew and I have actually even had this conversation before. The guy in 1997 was named to the top 10 list of all-time NBA coaches on the occasion of the 50th anniversary, even though I think he's got a losing record all time, but he was still considered one of the 50 greatest coaches, or I'm sorry, one of the 10 greatest coaches in the first 50 years of the NBA. So maybe not an all-time great coach. And I'm right about that. He was 944 and 1106. So sub 500 for his career, but won a title, took another team to the NBA Finals, made it to the playoffs at least once with every team he coached. So a very interesting and varied career for Bill Fitch.
Yeah, it was. Like you said, I mean, greatest of all time, I'm not sure. He just definitely hung around longer than most coaches get to hang around. 25 seasons as a head coach is definitely a long time. I will say this, though, is he was the original coach of the Cleveland Cavaliers when they were an expansion team. So he suffered through some very rough seasons getting started, trying to get Cleveland off the ground as an expansion team. I think he only won 15 games that very first season with the expansion Cavs. So it's so if you kind of take away those couple of seasons, it doesn't look so bad. But yeah, he was a guy that I think they used to call him in to basically fix the team. I mean, to what extent he actually did that, we can argue that, but it seems like he was always called in when a team was underperforming. A lot of talent, maybe not as many victories. They fire the previous coach, and then in comes Bill Fitch to try to fix things. And like you said, I mean, he took everybody at least to one playoffs. So,
and I think that's a really good point to mention, that he started in the hole by coaching those Cavs teams in the 70s. Those Cavs teams in the 70s that had such a chaotic ownership that they had to change the rules about being able to trade draft picks so that to basically stop, what was it, Stepien was his last name, and Fitch was actually the coach for what was really the crowning achievement of that Cavs franchise until at least the late 80s, what they call it, the miracle at Richfield. The miracle. They won. They got out of the first round of the playoffs, and that was probably rightfully considered a miracle with what was going on with that team. It's not totally fair to base his career record on, to look at his career record and not acknowledge that, he started in quite an unfortunate hole because of taking over an expansion team that was chaotically run, shall we say.
Yeah, I think he had a Walt Frazier who was on his last legs. He had Nate Thurman who was on his last legs. I mean, he really was just doing what he could with what he had in those first few years. But it was his first job in the NBA. So, I mean, coming from the college ranks, I think he was at the University of Minnesota when he got the call from the Cavs. So, I mean, can't turn that down.
Yeah, you're absolutely right about that, Rick. His immediately preceding job was 2 years with Minnesota from 68 to 70. His career is kind of his coaching career. The two things that stand out to me the most are these two sort of what ifs. And the first what if is this early 80s Celtics team. Like you said, he kind of came in late 70s, early 80s. It was after they had won the titles under Heinsohn, and they were in a little bit of a lull. And he comes in, he coaches them. What a lot of people don't realize is in 1980, that is to say the 1980 playoffs, so the 79-80 season, the Celtics are a really, really good team. I think they were a 60-win team. In 79-80, they were 61-21. And this is his first year with the team, 61-21. It's also Bird's rookie year, but this is not what you might think of as sort of the classic 80s Celtics. It's, Dennis Johnson and Danny Ainge are a long way away. McHale's not in the league yet. Parrish is still in Golden State. This is Bird and Cowens together on a front line, along with Cedric Maxwell. Pistol Pete Maravich is actually on this team as sort of a spot role and plays in the playoffs for them. I think he either joins the midseason, he plays like 40 games for them. So this is a very different team. And then in 81, Cowens retires. They make the big trade for Parrish, and they draft McHale with the draft choice they get as a part of that trade. And that's when they really start to get hot. 81, Andrew and I have talked about this before. They come back from 3-1 down. They beat the Celtics in the 81 Eastern Conference Finals game.
Sixers.
I'm sorry, did I say they beat the Celtics? No, that would be nonsensical. They beat the Sixers. My in-laws always talk about my wife's parents, this 81 game 7 against Philly was like the most fun they've ever had at a basketball game there, from Boston and Celtics fans. And then after winning in 81, his attitude starts to grate on the players. And even though they have an even better season in 81-82, they win 63 games, lose in the conference finals, again, 7-game series. This time they lose to Philly, and then he has one more year in 83, and then they fire him and bring in the much more low-key Casey Jones. But if his players had been able to stand him, he might have been the coach for all three of those Celtics championships in the 1980s.
Yeah, definitely. And as I was looking through his record, and I think kind of what you're speaking to has to do, I think, with his time in the Marines. So he graduates from college, I think it was in 54. And then he spent 2 years in the Marines as a drill instructor, and then came out of the Marines and then took his first head coaching job. I think he started 1 year at a high school before moving into the college ranks. But I got to imagine, but he was known for running those very tough, high discipline practices. And I think it's that sort of Marine military approach that he took. And I think most teams, especially if they're struggling, will appreciate that for a year or maybe 2 years, but then it starts to wear on you. I think I don't think that most NBA players can take kind of the military approach for too long, and that's where he probably kind of wore out his welcome. But you're right, he could have been there for all three of those 80s championships with the Celtics.
And by 83, the team is basically in open rebellion against him. Quinn Buckner says, "I've never been on a team where there was an active mutiny like that." Buckner recalled decades later, he said, "It was embarrassing. I was like, geez, they hate this guy." So they really did. I think this is the relatively recent book by Dan Shaughnessy on those 80s Lakers teams. Shaughnessy tells a story of ML Carr, who wants to bring his son along on the team bus. And I think, Rick, this kind of gets back to what you were saying about this sort of military discipline and rules and tight ship. Fitch won't let Carr's son ride on the bus, so he has to walk his son up to the press bus and say, my son Michael has to ride with you guys to the game, or wherever it is they're going, back from the game, back to the hotel, whatever it is, because Fitch is running such a tight ship. Now, Larry Bird disagrees when they get rid of Fitch in 84. And I was actually surprised by this, because I had always heard that a big reason that Fitch went out of Boston was because Bird couldn't stand him. But Bird actually gives a quote. He says, basically, someday you'll look back and realize Bill Fitch was the best coach for this team. So Bird, who obviously is a disciplined guy, he likes Fitch, or at least he doesn't want to see him go, but he rubs his guys the wrong way. And I think you're right. I think it's hard to say it was the wrong decision, because right after they fire him, they win a championship. They win another one 2 years later. Celtics become a very veteran team. Bird gets older, Parrish, McHale. They trade for Dennis Johnson. Walton comes in as a free agent for a year or two. So probably a guy like Casey Jones, who'd been an NBA player himself, had been a Celtic, understood that mentality, was probably a better fit for the Celtics long term, I would have to say.
Yeah, I agree with that. Casey Jones, exactly, having been a player, having won a bunch of rings, being part of that Celtics family. The one thing I will say about the Celtics organization is they do a great job of keeping their veterans connected to the organization. The Celtics, they have the kind of, I think they still do it like an annual reunion of all their championship veterans every summer or something like that, where they keep those guys in contact. So to bring back Casey Jones, make him the head coach, he understands, that the superstars need to lead. He was probably willing to give Bird and Parrish and Dennis Johnson a little more leeway in what happens with the team, because he knows those are smart guys. He knows that, Larry Bird probably knew as much basketball as he did at that point.
And then I think the other thing that bears mentioning when we're talking about Fitch is he leaves the Celtics and ends up in Houston. And then just as they're drafting Ralph Sampson and then Akeem Olajuwon, and this team beats the Lakers in the conference finals in 1986 in what is not a particularly close series. I think it's a 5-game series. And then they play Boston, lose in 6, and then basically as quickly as this all came together, it essentially falls apart. Sampson gets hurt the following year. Eventually they end up trading Sampson. I think John Lucas, who had been a guard with the team, has a drug issue. I think there might be drug issues with a couple of other guys. Akeem becomes sort of a malcontent for the late 80s and early 90s until he has a renaissance in his own career. And this is the only non-Laker team to make it to the NBA Finals from the Western Conference between 1982 and 1989. And that Rocket team tends to kind of get lost in the shuffle. But for 1 year, everybody really thought this was the new hot thing in the NBA, and it's only injuries and some other off the court issues that really derail it. But everybody thought the Rockets had taken over the West from the Lakers rather, when they win that Western Conference Finals in '86.
Oh yeah, they had that twin towers you said with Samson and Olajuwon. He got Samson was, I think, 7'3". Olajuwon was, I think, officially 6'11", but let's just call him a 7-footer for this conversation. I remember reading an old article from Sports Illustrated back in the 80s, and right around that time, 85, 86, the article said that there were now 19 7-footers in the NBA, almost a 7-footer for each team. 23 teams, 19 guys, and the Rockets had 2 of them. And that was, I mean, it's all about, you can't teach height, right? That's what they say. You can't teach height. So to have basically 14 feet of front court, of excellent all-star level front court, at least until Samson's knees went out on him. But to have that level of front court was just incredible. I mean, they were supposed to take on McHale and Parrish, and I don't know, whatever other front court duo you could think of, probably just McHale and Parrish at that point. But yeah, that was the future. That was what, if social media existed back then, that all you'd see was posts of Samson and Olajuwon as the next great duo.
This doesn't relate to Fitch really, but it's kind of funny to think about that in 1986, when you would have said, oh, the Rockets will be the next Western Conference team to win a championship, like besides the Lakers, they actually were. It was just, it was 8 years longer than anybody would have anticipated. But 94 was the next non-Lakers Western Conference team to win a title. So
it was. Yeah, it was. I mean, they finally had to rebuild it way after Fitch was gone with Tomjanovich.
Now, where did Fitch go after Houston? Because we said he made the playoffs, 5 times?
Well, he made more than 5. He made at least one with each of the 5 teams. So so after Houston, he ends up, I can't remember the order. It's either with New Jersey.
He goes to the Nets after that. He's the Nets coach immediately before Chuck Daly in the early 90s. 91, 92 is his last year with the Nets. And that's Petrovic and Derek Coleman and Kenny Anderson and those guys sort of starting to join the team that would become sort of the Nets of the mid 90s. We actually did an episode way back when, about 2 years ago, on those 90s New Jersey Nets with my friend Abe. And so he goes there and then he finishes out his career. And this is where I remember him. I remember him with the Clippers. And it was just, Clippers, I think this was like the Danny Manning era Clippers. Yeah. Not very good, but he manages to get in. This maybe doesn't deserve too much credit. At 36-46 in 96-97, they make the Western Conference playoffs and get swept 3-0 in the first round. But hey,
by Utah?
Let me check that. My guess is it probably would have been Utah.
I feel like I remember that series.
Yep, 3-0 to Utah in 96-97. So, a couple of different what ifs. I want to kind of put a mark on this. Bill Simmons, in his book of basketball, which is now about 15 years old, he talks about what happens with this Rocket team after 86. He says the following year, both Sampson and Hakeem wanted new contracts. They trade John Lucas to Milwaukee. Lucas has got some drug issues, so they want to give him a fresh start. They suffer cocaine suspensions for both Lewis Lloyd and Mitchell Wiggins. By the 87 All-Star break, their 3 best guards are gone. Sampson had fallen, interestingly enough, I think it was in a regular season game at the Boston Garden. His injuries start to surface to his back and his hip. He starts having to run a little bit differently. They finally trade him to Houston or to Golden State for Joe Barry Carroll and Sleepy Floyd. And this is what Simmons says, and I think it's kind of worth quoting it a little bit at length here. He says, here's the best way to put Houston's demise in perspective. Let's say the Pistons fell apart after the 86 playoffs because Isaiah Snead betrayed him and Dennis Rodman, Vinnie Johnson, and John Sally were all kicked out of the league for cocaine. What happens? The Celtics probably play in at least 2 more finals. Maybe they steal one or both. Maybe Jordan wins 8 titles instead of 6. Maybe Dominique and the Hawks sneak into the finals one year. And that's sort of his analog in the Western Conference. If Sampson doesn't get hurt, if this Rocket team doesn't fall apart, maybe the Lakers win a couple less, the Blazers never get in. All of these teams that maybe made it in the late 80s and early 90s get shoved aside by this Twin Towers team of Sampson and Olajuwon. So another what if in the career of Bill Fitch. Rick, you're going to be back to join us in a little bit to talk about Bob Lanier. But before we let you go here, why don't you tell us a little bit about your podcast on the Sports History Network, Basketball History 101?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for that. So Basketball History 101, we put out a new episode every Tuesday and just find a different story from basketball history, whether it's kind of in the NBA from the 50s, 60s, 70s. Occasionally we'll go all the way back into the 20s and 30s, 1920s and 1930s to look at what professional basketball looked like prior to the NBA. So we've got, all throughout, if you want to hear basketball history, how the game developed. We have an episode on the history of the dribble, the history of the jump shot, that kind of thing. And as I say at the beginning of every episode, we're bringing old school basketball to a new school audience.
Yep. I've heard that when I've listened to your show. I've heard that intro, and I really like that. Yeah, you really kind of get all over the place with it, which we like. And like I said, there's not a lot of basketball specific content on the network. So we definitely are glad to have you be a part of it. Rick, thanks so much for joining us, and we will hear from you again in a little bit.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Rick.
Yep. Thanks.
All right. So moving right along, Andrew, do you want to read the name of our next honoree?
Sure. Charlie Taylor, born in 1941, passed away on February 19th. A Hall of Fame wide receiver with the Washington Redskins, Taylor began his career as a running back and won Rookie of the Year honors in 1964. Moving to receiver in 1966, he retired as the NFL's all-time leader in receptions in 1977. In 1972, Taylor's 2 touchdowns over Dallas in the NFC title game propelled the Redskins to their first ever Super Bowl appearance.
And we are lucky to have another one of our fellow hosts on the Sports History Network here joining us today. Dana Auguster from the Historically Speaking Sports podcast. Thanks for joining us. Dana's you're gonna hear him in and out talking about a few different people over the next couple of episodes. But Dana, thanks for doing this again with us this year, and thank you for joining us.
Man, thank you so much for having me back. I'm really honored and privileged to be invited back to talk about these guys. And hey, let's do it. I mean, these guys right here, I know a lot about offhand because I've been, studying up on them over the last few years, and it's unfortunate to hear of their passing. And I'm just so thankful and honored to be invited back with you guys to talk about them.
So let's start with Taylor. Tell us a little bit about Charlie Taylor. First of all, tell us about him, and then what was it that made him be somebody you wanted to come on and discuss with us?
Well, Charlie Taylor, I think, in my opinion, is one of the more underrated great NFL receivers because he played at a time with a team that was primarily a running team. You had Larry Brown, who was their running back. You had James Haraway, who was their fullback. And at the time, his coach, George Allen, was a proponent of the run. Of course, Washington in the early 70s, they had the Over the Hill Gang, which is a team that they're not my favorite team, obviously, with as Washington went, but they were a team that I found very interesting to learn a lot about and read about. And offensively, Charlie Taylor was the centerpiece of that passing attack. You had Taylor on one side, and then you had Roy Jefferson on the other side. And you had I can't think of the tight end's name offhand, but they were a very, very interesting team to kind of look at and read about. And it's, of course, the early 70s. I was born in 73, so obviously I didn't see them play like talking about. But I just found that team very interesting with the cast of characters that was on the team, and George Allen himself being the type of coach that he was. I just found that team very interesting, and offensively, Charlie Taylor was the centerpiece of that offense.
Looks like the tight end was a guy named Jerry Smith.
Jerry Smith. Jerry Smith. Yes.
Yeah, he was there 65 to 77, so quite a bit of overlap with Taylor.
There are a lot of interesting characters sort of associated with those late 60s, early 70s Washington Redskin teams. First of all, George Allen almost wasn't the coach, or there was an alternative history where he wouldn't have been the coach, because in 69, Vince Lombardi comes, takes over the Redskins, leads them to their first winning season in however many years it had been. And then he tragically gets cancer, passes away. And then George Allen, I don't believe Allen took directly over. I think there was a gap year. I think
there was a gap, but I can't think of the coach's name in between there. It was an assistant coach.
I think it was Bill Austin.
Bill Austin. He took over and for in between Lombardi, and then they hired George Allen away from the Rams, where the Rams had fired him and replaced him with Tommy Protho, and then Allen took over, and that's when everything kind of took off for the Redskins. But what's interesting is the fact that his quarterback, Charlie Taylor's quarterback for most of his career, was Sonny Jurgensen. You know, everybody, thinks about the Over the Hill Gang, and you think of Kilmer, but most of the time it was actually Sonny Jurgensen, which is another very underrated quarterback, I think, because a lot of people, when they talk about great quarterbacks, Sonny Jurgensen isn't named all that much. And the reason why, I believe, is because that the Redskins had sub 500 records throughout most of his career with the Redskins. And, and his favorite target was Charlie Taylor.
Yeah, and in fact, as we mentioned, Taylor started as a running back, and I watched video last night on Taylor, sort of a little brief, 5-minute synopsis of his career. And Jurgensen says that the strength of Charlie Taylor, that, sort of he had more of the running back's body, that strength made it harder for cornerbacks to cover him. It created sort of a mismatch.
That's right. I mean, if you look at film of him during the 60s and early 70s, you notice that he would catch, say, like a 7-yard square in, catch it in the middle of right in between it, in that zone between the linebackers and defensive backs. And he would make like about 4 or 5 moves, and he would just make people miss and pushing people off and spin moves and everything. And he kind of like invented quote unquote yak yards. And if I had to compare him, which I love to do, I love to compare like old guys to guys that are playing now. If you had to compare him to someone that's playing now, the first name I would think of course, being in Atlanta, is Cordero Patterson for the Falcons. And he's a lot like him. Cordero Patterson is a receiver, but he's not built like one. He's built like a tailback, like a bigger tailback. And that's how Charlie Taylor played, but he played way back in the 1960s and early 70s, which gave him, a little bit of an advantage because he was stronger and bigger than most cornerbacks at the time, because cornerbacks at the time was like anywhere between 5'10", 6 feet, sort of. They weren't big guys, but he had the strength to move them out of the way and stiff arm them whenever he got those quick passes from Jurgensen.
And his career is sort of a trip through kind of a little bit the history of the franchise. When he first got to the team, he was mentored by Bobby Mitchell, famous Hall of Fame wide receiver in his own right, who's also well known for being the guy who integrated the Washington Redskins in the early 1960s, 62, I think it was. And then this is something that I didn't realize until I was researching him over the last couple of days. He was the Redskins wide receiver coach from 81 all the way until 1994, and that's the golden age, or at least the modern golden age, the golden age post Sammy Baugh of the Washington franchise. And that's all those other wide receivers, Art Monk, who's in the Hall of Fame, and Ricky Sanders and some of those other guys. So he went all the way from being mentored by Bobby Mitchell, who was sort of a pioneer on the team, all the way up all through the Joe Gibbs era, and all those many quarterbacks, Theismann, Williams, Rippon, that they had. And he was a part of that team, got 3 Super Bowl rings, and as an assistant coach. So really a guy who saw a lot in the history of that Washington franchise.
Well, he was picked by Joe Gibbs to be their receivers coach in 81 after being a scout with the aforementioned Bobby Mitchell. They were scouts. Right after that, he retired. He became a Washington Redskins scout, and then later became an assistant coach, a wide receivers coach. Now, you got to also remember that he coached the Smurfs, the wide receiver corps in the early 80s, with Virgil Say and Charlie Brown and Alvin Garrett, along with Monk, and then later Gary Clark, Ricky Sanders, Clint Didier, the tight end. He coached all of those guys. And eventually got his Super Bowl rings, but not as a player, but as a coach. And you remember in their 70s, the Redskins were a perennial playoff team. And Andrew had mentioned earlier about the 1972 NFC Championship game, which he labels as his greatest game, catching 2 touchdown passes to beat the rival Dallas. They blew them out at RFK Stadium. He catches a long, like a 45-yard touchdown pass from Billy Kilmer down the far sideline at RFK. And that really put the game out of reach for the Redskins to give them their first Super Bowl appearance against the Dolphins, which were perfect that year.
That's really, too, if you think about, at that point, my brother sort of invoked the post-Sammy Baugh era. So we'll do the same thing here. Up until those early 80s teams, this was the biggest Redskin victory in, of a 50-year span. Not only are you getting to your first Super Bowl, but you're beating the Cowboys, who were, what did the Cowboys made the last 2 Super Bowls before that?
Yes.
And gold standard in the NFC and would continue to be for most of the 70s. But yeah, certainly between, the 40s and probably the 82 NFC Championship game, that was the most significant win in the franchise's history in that stretch. And he was, I know they didn't give the MVP out back then for a championship game, but he probably would have been the MVP of that game if they had had such a thing.
I mean, absolutely. He was, like I said before, that team offensively had a lot of weapons for Billy Kilmer, because Billy Kilmer became was the quarterback in that game. He replaced Jurgensen, I think, toward the middle of that season. Jurgensen was injured. He had broke his ankle in one game, and Kilmer took over, and the team just caught fire after that happened. And from that point on, in the NFC Championship game, Charlie Taylor was I think I have his stats for that game. He had 7 catches for 146 yards with 2 touchdowns, including a 45-yard touchdown pass from Kilmer. So that was by far his greatest game for, like you said, Drew, the quintessential great game in Redskins history between the time of Sammy Baugh in the 1930s and 40s, all the way through to the 82 NFC Championship game, which they beat Dallas at RFK Stadium once again, So, and of course, beating Dallas in the playoffs that year, beating Dallas at all for a Redskins team was the high watermark any year, because that was, of course, Redskins Cowboys rivalries, like one of the best and most known in NFL history.
I was just saying there's a lot of parallels with the 80 Eagles, the same thing where, for a 30 to 40 year span, that was their big victory, was the NFC Championship game against Dallas in 1980, beating the Cowboys. And it was, they were sort of the benchmark where if you got one from them, especially after years of them torturing you, which they did to everybody in that division in the 70s, that not only getting past them, but getting past them to get to a Super Bowl was the big deal for both of those franchises.
That's right.
And that was sort of the premier NFC East matchup of the 70s. Giants were terrible, as Andrew and I have mentioned several times, and Philly wasn't very good either. So Cowboys, Redskins, that was the NFC. And really kind of in a lot of ways, that was kind of, even though the Redskins only made one, it wasn't as if, the Cowboys were the powerhouse of the NFC in the 1970s. They made, I would have to think through and count how many Super Bowls. I guess Minnesota would have been the other team in there. So, but yeah, that Redskin Cowboy, that was a big rivalry.
70, 71, 74, 77, and 78, right?
So half the years, 5 out of 10.
Yeah, half of them.
Half the decade, the Cowboys were in the Super Bowl from the NFC.
And
they weren't on this one thanks to Charlie Taylor.
Exactly. Well, Dana, thanks for joining us. We won't linger with you here because Dana will be back a few more times over the next couple hours. So, Dana, thanks for joining us, and we will hear from you again soon.
Looking forward to it, guys.
All right, so why don't we move on to baseball, our first baseball player of the year, and we're going to talk about Ralph Terry, who was born in 1936 and died on March 16th. A 2-time All-Star with the New York Yankees, Terry surrendered Bill Mazeroski's famous home run in Game 7 of the 1960 World Series against the Pittsburgh Pirates. 2 years later, Terry redeemed himself, leading the American League in wins and retiring Willie McCovey to win the World Series for New York in 7 games over the San Francisco Giants. Terry was named MVP of the 1962 World Series. two of the classic World Series in not just Yankee history, but in baseball history, 1960 and 1962. 1960, Yankee fans tend to know the story. The Yankees played the Pirates, huge underdogs. I want to give you the scores here because it really kind of tells you the kind of series that it was. So just bear with me here for one quick second. All right, here we go. 1960 World Series, Pirates against the Yankees. And keep in mind that the Yankees had basically been to the World Series almost every year, 8 of the 10 years in the 1950s. They had missed it in 1959, but then came roaring back. 1960, which was Roger Maris' first year with the Yankees. So the 1960 World Series, Yankees lose game 1 6-4, and then they win game 2 16-3. They win game 3 10-0. Then they lose 3-2. Lose 5-2, come back in game 6 to win 12-0, and then they lose in the epic World Series game 7 to the Pirates when Ralph Terry gives up the home run to Mazeroski. The only World Series game in MLB history. Do you know what this is? Do you know what it is? There's something that doesn't happen in this World Series game. It's the only time it ever happens in World Series history.
This is game 7 of the 60 World Series.
Yeah.
Is it something like, was there not a base runner at any point in the game or something like that?
There was no strikeout.
Oh, okay. I knew it was something like.
Yeah. Nobody struck out the entire game. And so the Yankees outscore the Pirates 55-27, but they lose the series 10-9, game 7 score on this home run given up by Ralph Terry to Bill Mazeroski. And Andrew and I have speculated that there's a good chance that if Bill Mazeroski doesn't hit that home run, that he probably doesn't make it into the Baseball Hall of Fame. So
I don't think there's any doubt about that.
You think he's definitely not in?
No. First of all, it took them like 40 years to put him in, and then they were like, "Well, he was good at defense." Like that was their rationale. And I'm not even saying it's that big of a deal. Like, yeah, guy has one of the most famous moments of all time. Go ahead and put him in. But like, yeah, I think it's because of that play. Yeah.
So Terry gives up this home run, and everybody kind of realizes that Casey Stengel, who's been managing the Yankees since 1949, he's 70 years of age. Everybody kind of knows that if they lose the series, Stengel is probably going to be forced out the door, and he's going to have to be retired. And so after the game, Terry walks over to Stengel and he says, "Casey, I hate to have it end this way." And Stengel says, "Well, how are you operating? And what were you trying to throw him?" And Terry says, "I was trying to keep it low." And Casey says, "Well, as long as you were trying to pitch him the right way, I'm going to sleep easy at night." And Stengel, especially by this point, was not necessarily beloved by a lot of his players, but Terry did feel bad that his pitch might end up costing Stengel his job. Ralph Terry, very much kind of the classic Yankee story, comes up to the Yankees.
I think I know where you're going with this.
Where do you think I'm going?
The fact that they just traded him to Kansas City because they wanted to use him as a minor league. This guy's not ready yet. We like his potential, so we'll just trade him to another team in our league who we're illegally using as a farm system.
Yeah, that was not good. And that, I don't know, basically the story is that for most of the sort of mid to late 1950s, the Yankees would just kind of basically use Kansas City as a farm system. And if they wanted somebody from the Kansas City roster, they'd get them. There's any number of guys who started with the Yankee system and then were with Kansas City for a year or two and then came back to the Yankees, almost like they got called up to the big team. Terry actually gets traded in June of 57. He gets traded to the Kansas City A's as part of the same deal that got rid of Billy Martin, that shipped Billy Martin out of town when they had gotten tired of Martin. And so he goes there in 57, but then in 59, he gets traded back from Kansas City to the Yankees, and he becomes one of their key pitchers of the 1960s, including in this epic World Series loss of Game 7 or of 1960, I should say. But he really rallies. Let me just give you a little bit of information here about Terry's 1962 season. It was his finest in the major leagues. He won 23 games, led American League pitchers in wins, innings pitched, and home runs allowed, and set personal highs in nearly every category. During the second half of the year, Terry was 16-5, and his 23 wins were the most for a Yankee right-hander since 1928. Waite Hoyt had that record, a Hall of Famer, in 1928. And so in another epic 7-game World Series, he finds himself on the mound against another Hall of Famer in Willie McCovey, who is a legit Hall of Famer in every sense of the word. And he entices McCovey to line out on a hard-hit liner to Bobby Richardson. And 2 years after he is the GOAT and the losing pitcher in 1960, he is the hero and the series MVP of the 1962 World Series against the San Francisco Giants.
Couple of anecdotes I have here. Did you hear towards the end of his career, he was with the Mets and he pitched against Bill Mazeroski again. Terry's first pitch was over Mazeroski's head as a reminder that he hadn't forgotten. He then retired the second baseman on a pop-up. He said when Terry traveled to Los Angeles, he ran into his old manager, Casey Stengel, and said, "Hey, Casey, I got Mazeroski out. I pitched him low." And Stengel said, "It's about time." He also, after he retired, he went and became a professional golfer. He was actually, I think, qualified and was able to play in a couple of PGA eventually, I think originally regular PGA Tour. He wasn't a full-time member, but he won a couple of regionals and was able to play. And then he played on the PGA. He then played on the PGA Senior Tour for a while. But one thing I didn't know about him that I learned doing the research of this, did you read or do you know about the thing when he signed? So this is a legit, this is from, I'm going to assume this source is legit. It's on the internet, but I don't think people are writing long articles about Ralph Terry to then just throw a lie in there in the beginning. But basically what happened was in 1953, he signed with the Yankees and then he signed with the Cardinals. And it says the dispute ended up on the desk of Commissioner Ford Frick. What happened was that Terry was scouted by Tom Greenwade, who was also the guy who discovered Mickey Mantle.
Yeah.
The young pitcher signed his mother's name on a telegram accepting the Yankees contract. Then a Cardinal scout visited, told him that wasn't binding, and offered to sign him and have him assigned to nearby Omaha, which was close to where he grew up in Oklahoma, and he agreed. The Yankees accused St. Louis of tampering with the signed player. Frick determined that both teams acted in good faith, but that Terry's acceptance of the Yankees contract was binding. So he signed. He signed to two teams in the course of a couple of weeks or a couple of days, whatever it was.
Two quick stories about the 62 Game 7, just to round it out. First of all, the night before the game, they're out in San Francisco. And this was a World Series, by the way, where it rained for 3 or 4 days. And so they were just sort of stuck out on the coast waiting for the World Series to resume. And so the night before Game 7, Mantle, Ford, Yogi Berra, Ralph Terry, and Clete Boyer are having a poker game, a high-stakes poker game in Mickey Mantle's hotel room. Towards the end of the evening, Yogi and Ralph are battling for several $100s in the pot. Yogi, who many Yankees believed to be the luckiest man alive, the joke was always he could fall down in a sewer and come out holding a gold watch. He has a king high flush, and Terry foolishly stays in the game hoping for a spade flush, an ace high flush, and eventually gets it. Terry gets it on the last card. And this is a classic book called Dynasty by Peter Golenbach about those Yankee years. And it says, one at a time, Terry showed his spades 3, 5, 10, jack, and ace. As Terry gleefully raked in the chips, Berra across from him was mumbling swear words. Terry was saying, I beat Yogi, man, it's an omen. And he collected his $300 and went to bed. And then the next day, he's on the mound, 9th inning against the Giants, and Matty Alou, with the Yankees are up 1-0. Matty Alou is on first base, and then Terry gets the next two batters out. Then Willie Mays steps into the batter's box. Mays gets a base hit to the opposite field. Roger Maris fields the ball and throws it in and manages to hold Alou up at third base. And a lot of people have always thought that Alou should have rounded third and tried to score, but there's runners on second and third, and you got two more future Hall of Famers. So keep in mind, he's facing three of the greatest sluggers of all time, back to back to back. Mays, McCovey, and then Orlando Cepeda is on deck. So Ralph Houck comes out and says, basically, who do you want to pitch to? Do you want to pitch to McCovey or do you want to pitch to Cepeda? And because a base hit wins the game. A single scores Alou from third. It scores Willie Mays from second base. And that's it. That's 2-1. That's the ball game. That's the World Series. And Terry chooses to pitch to McCovey because he doesn't want it to pitch too carefully. And so if he walks McCovey and then the bases are loaded, he's got to be worried about the tying run scoring on a walk. So he figures, let's pitch to McCovey. I have first base open. I can pitch carefully, but try and get him. And he does. McCovey rips it to second base. Richardson makes the stab. The Giants don't make it back to another World Series until 1989, so 27 years. Mm-hmm. That is the last World Series of World Championship of that great sort of Yankee run that started all the way back 40 years ago with Babe Ruth in 1923. That's what is that? Is that their 20th?
That would have been 20, yeah, because they won 2 in the 70s, so that was 20.
And they don't win another one for another 15 years, and Ralph Terry redeems himself in his best year as a Yankee. Why don't we move on? And Andrew, do you want to read our next entry?
Sure. Rayfield Wright, born in 1945, died on April 7th. Wright started offensive tackle for the Dallas Cowboys from 1967 until 1979. During that time, he played in 6 Super Bowls or NFL championship games, winning 2. Wright was named to 6 Pro Bowls in a row from 1971 to 1976 and was first or second team All-Pro each of those seasons as well. He was elected into the Pro Football Hall of Fame in 2006.
He was made it into 5 Super Bowls, won the 2. Like I said, kind of is there for that whole run of the Cowboys. It's starting in the late 60s with the Don Meredith years. He's not a starter, but we talked about the Ice Bowl. He is on the roster. He's a Cowboy for the Ice Bowl in 1967, plays in that game as a rookie, and then is with Dallas all the way up through basically the end of the run in 1979. He is part of the offensive line that leads blocking for the first 5 1,000-yard rushers in Cowboy history. So that's Dwayne Thomas, that's Tony Dorsett, a leader on the offensive line of those teams for basically the beginning of the 60s and the entire 70s. Jerry Jones says after Rayfield dies, he says, Rayfield Wright was the epitome of what it takes to be a Hall of Famer. His grit, his agility, his passion, his charisma, and his love for football, the community, and his family always shined through.
The thing I thought was interesting when I looked at this, so he played right tackle once he finally settled in. These days, we think of the left tackle as the most important position on the offensive line for a team with a right-handed quarterback, which is most of them, because the left tackle protects the quarterback's blind side. I don't know when this changed, but back in this era, the right tackle was considered the most important offensive lineman. A, it was an era, obviously, where teams threw less, and B, I don't know this. I'm sure I could look up the exact reasoning behind why it shifted, but that was considered the most important position on the offensive line, and it was where you ended up matched up with the other team's best pass rushers for the most part. He was small, or not small, but he was light. He was very agile and light on his feet. And even though this thing says he was kind of miscast at the beginning of his career as either a defensive end or a tight end because he was not built like offensive tackles were back then. So it took them a few years to realize, this guy we're trying to mold into a tight end is actually our best offensive tackle. And once they corrected that mistake, he basically just sat in that position for the rest of the 1970s. He's on the 1970s NFL All-Decade team. So, obviously a guy, let me just see who they have as the 2 tackles. Just for reference, he is an offensive tackle. He is the 1 tackle on the All-Decade team for the 1970s. Do you know who the other one is?
70s.
The first team. There's a second team as well, but the first team.
Is it Yale Larry?
Art Shell.
Yeah, well, that's good company. Roger Staubach says Rayfield was a big, strong guy that was able to transfer his size and strength from tight end to tackle, like you said, Andrew. He also had such quick feet that he was able to deal with some of the faster defensive ends and even the linebacker blitzes. If he ever got beat, I don't remember it. The Hall of Fame defensive end of the famous Minnesota Vikings Purple People Eaters said, quote, let me find this quote here. He says, an all-day fight with Rayfield Wright is definitely not my idea of a pleasant Sunday afternoon. So another great, maybe the great Hall of Fame defensive lineman is Deacon Jones of the Rams in the 60s and 70s. And as a young player in his first start at offensive tackle, he goes up against Deacon Jones, and Deacon Jones says, "Hey boy, does your mama know you're out here?" And Rayfield Wright says, "What does my mama have to do with this?" And he's thinking, he doesn't say that, I'm sorry, he's thinking that, and that distracted him enough to momentarily lose concentration when the ball was snapped. Jones promptly slaps his hand against Rayfield Wright's helmet, reeling him to the turf. He says it was just as if I'd been hit by a baseball bat. It was a different game in those days. And a guy who played in the trenches for, like I said, 10, 12 years against some of the best NFL players of all time. Oh, and then Gil Brandt, who's the Hall of Fame executive for the Dallas Cowboys, says that in that same game, despite his intimidation, Rayfield Wright played well, and he didn't allow a sack, and he didn't really allow Deacon Jones to do anything, and he ended up being named the team's player of the game for that game. So even against an all-time great like Deacon Jones, Rayfield Wright more than knew how to hold his own. Why don't we move on? And we once again have a New York Islander legend, and that is Mike Bossy, who was born in 1957 and passed away on April 15th. Bossy played his entire 10-year career with the New York Islanders and won 4 Stanley Cups. Bossy twice led the league in goals and holds the NHL record for highest career goals per game. His number 22 was retired by the Isles in 1992, only the second player so honored by the team. He also won the NHL's Lady Byng Trophy for sportsmanship 3 times.
He's the greatest Islander of all time. He was the best player on those teams. I'm not the expert on the Islanders. I think most people have Potvin second, and then Mike Bossy number 1. He is still 22nd all time in goals. In 80-81, he scored 50 goals in 50 games. There was a sort of a race as to who was going to be the first one to score 50 goals in 50 games. He had 2 in his 50th game to get there. Scored 573 goals and had 553 assists in his career in only 752 games. 85 goals and 75 assists in 129 playoff games. At retirement, he held the record for the highest goals per season average, which was over 57, and obviously was the linchpin for a team that, won 4 straight Stanley Cups and then went to a 5th one. Most consecutive 50-goal-plus seasons, most 50-goal-plus seasons not consecutively, most 60-goal seasons, highest goals per game average, most power play goals in one. Wow, these are starting to get to one season, but he's consistently on the greatest hockey players of all times list, probably just below the absolute upper echelon guys who non-hockey fans even recognize the name. But yeah, he's 1997, so obviously you probably knock him down another 10 or 12 pegs just in the last thing. But in 1997, he was ranked number 20 in greatest hockey players of all time, which was a decade after his retirement. So you would imagine even now he's still in the top 40 and is the greatest New York Islander of all time.
About 30 years ago now, George Vesey, the New York Times columnist and sports reporter for many years, says, Mike Bossy was a wing the way Tom Seaver was a pitcher, the way Walt Frazier was a guard. So, yeah, a guy who, among that community of Islanders fans, sort of transcended everybody else and was, like you said, he is the greatest Islander of all time. All right, why don't we move on to another guy in another sport?
Yes. All right. Daryle Lamonica, born in 1941. died on April 21st. Known as the Mad Bomber, Lamonica led a prolific Oakland Raider passing attack in the late 1960s, winning 2 MVP awards and leading the Raiders to the Super Bowl in 1967. Lamonica's .791 winning percentage as a starting quarterback is second only to Otto Graham in NFL history. He began his career as a backup to Jack Kemp in Buffalo, winning 2 AFL titles. I think the thing you need to remember about the Raiders is they didn't throw long because they got Lamonica. They got Lamonica because they wanted to throw long. That's from an old VHS tape that my brother and I had for years. I don't even remember what the rest of that thing was about, but I just remember that. That's how I learned who Daryle Lamonica was. And then he was in, I think, the second Hanukkah song by Adam Sandler. I don't think the first one, but either the second or third one.
You know that I just found out as I was researching this, he was actually drafted by the Lombardi Packers.
And was he?
And went to the AFL instead because he thought that would be a better place for him, whether it was playing time or winning or money or whatever it was. But yeah, he was drafted by Vince Lombardi's Packers. So,
well, if you think about what would have happened, he would have sat behind Bart Starr for 3 or 4 years and then probably been the one tasked with taking over, and it would have been a disaster. Like, I think he made the right decision, to be honest.
Yeah, I think he's probably a guy who falls maybe just short of being a Hall of Famer. He was a good player. He didn't have a great reception completion rate, but he was a 3-time AFL champion. So the 2 times with Jack Kemp as the backup in Buffalo, and then a 2-time AFL MVP, 67 and 69. So he's the last ever AFL most valuable player, leads the team to Super Bowl II against Lombardi and the Packers. And his best years are probably in the AFL. He runs the what's known as the Sid Gillman offense, which is this wide open AFL offense pioneered by Sid Gillman, who's the coach of the San Diego Chargers in the 1960s in the American Football League. He's famously the quarterback in the Heidi game, which was the game where, with the New York Jets up 2 touchdowns by 2 scores late in the game, the network NBC switched to a broadcast of the children's movie Heidi and away from the game. Then the Raiders scored 2 late touchdowns to take the lead and just defeat the Jets in, I believe that was 1967. And the beginning of sort of a series of good but not great quarterbacks for the Oakland Raiders, from him to Kenny Stabler, who's now in the Hall of Fame, and then Jim Plunkett, and sort of like Rayfield Wright was with the Cowboys, Daryle Lamonica was kind of there for the beginning of this long run of domination by the Raiders.
Yeah, he was named and it's a little, there's, multiple voting groups and things like that. So one of the years it wasn't a consensus, but he was some version of the AFL's most valuable player twice, in 67, which was the year that they lost Super Bowl II to the Packers. And then in 69, again, he was named again. I think that was the year where there was sort of a split consensus on who the MVP of the league was. I think he might have shared it with Namath that year, actually. But he, you're looking at a guy, 900 winning percentage in the AFL. And, the AFL was certainly a lesser level of competition, but it wasn't the USFL or the World Football League, where he ultimately did sign, but only threw 19 passes and then probably had his uniform sold from under him at halftime. Something, if you remember our AFL or our World Football League episode. But sort of a guy who, again, not to overstate the case, but was sort of symbolic of you didn't see that style in the NFL at that time. Like, I will just throw the ball all the way down the field like that. And that was a sort of hallmark of those very early Raiders teams, was sort of the very aggressive, high risk, high reward style of offense. And
he's throwing to some of the future Hall of Famers, Fred Biletnikoff. He's sort of the beginning of, like you said, of that passing attack. And a lot of those guys would remain on the team even after he was no longer around. But guys like Biletnikoff, I don't know if Cliff Branch was on the team during his time there, or if Branch was not until after Lamonica had retired. But the forerunner to some of those really sort of freewheeling, high octane, everybody's a character type of Oakland Raider team. So
looks like they would have overlapped a little bit. Branch's rookie year was in 72, so a little bit of overlap.
A little bit of overlap there. So yeah, definitely a unique figure in Oakland Raider history, a part of that lore, and a unique player in the history of the AFL. Why don't we move on and get back to a little bit of hockey here, and we'll talk about Guy LaFleur, who was born in 1951 and passed away on April 22nd. The first NHL player to score 50 goals in 6 consecutive seasons, LaFleur was a key member of the Montreal Canadiens dynasty of the 1970s, which won 5 Stanley Cups from 1973 to 1979. LaFleur twice won the Hart Memorial Trophy for the most valuable player in the league and was inducted into the Hall of Fame in 1988. He nonetheless came out of retirement that same year and played 3 additional seasons in the league, including one with the Rangers, actually, before he went back to he finished up with a Canadian team, but his original coming out of retirement was with the Rangers.
Well, and what happened was he came out with the Rangers and then finished with the Nordiques because he was with the head coach of the Rangers. I might not pronounce this correctly. I think it's Mikel Bergeron, had been the Rangers coach, and they were friends. So then when he got fired and went to Quebec, the Nordiques, LaFleur went with him, which, was probably a real boon to the Nordiques at the time, playing in Quebec with the Canadiens. Obviously second-class citizens, but now, even though he's in his 40s, they have one of the architects of that, one of the key players of that 70s Canadiens team playing for them. It also made him he was one of the few players he was probably one of the last players to not wear a helmet because he was grandfathered in, even though by the time he joined the league again in 1988, he'd been out of the league for however long, but he was still grandfathered in based on when his career started. So he was playing through 1991 without a helmet.
And that was really sort of the last great run of the Montreal Canadiens. They won the Stanley Cup in 93. They won it in 86. But that era of dominance of theirs really is that it's, maybe it's big in the 50s in the Rocket Richard years. But then with him, they win. What did we say here? They won
5, I believe.
They won 5 from 73 to 79. And he was the leader of that team. The coach of that team was Scotty Bowman, who is considered to be the best coach in the history of NHL hockey. Bowman won Stanley Cups with, I think, like 3 or 4 different franchises. So he's one of the all-time great coaches, and LaFleur, one of the all-time great players for the Canadiens. He nickname was the Flower for obvious reasons, and he was one of these guys. He was beloved by the Canadiens, one of the all-time great franchises in Northern American sports, and he is one of the most beloved players and the leader of that team in the 1970s.
He was called the Flower, like in English, because LaFleur means flower in English, but they also called him, I won't do the pronunciation correctly, but it's Le Démon Blonde. The Blonde Demon was what French fans called him. A couple of interesting I guess he was a little bit of I don't know if flamboyant's the right word, but he was certainly he was an athlete very much of the 70s in terms of being a little more flashy and less reserved, and the big sideburns and the sort of, obviously it comes with a little bit of a French Canadian spin, but the just sort of being a character, I guess, in a sport where, if you think about guys in the 60s, if you picture a player in the 60s in hockey, I just think of like those black and white pictures of guys in the dressing rooms and their faces are covered in blood. And then you got a guy who's a little bit more flashy. I did also want to point out that in 1979, he released the album LaFleur, consisting of Guy LaFleur reciting hockey instructions accompanied by disco music. I'm assuming the hockey instructions are in French, but
Good Lord.
I just thought that was interesting. He won an MVP in 1977. It looks like something like that, somewhere in that range. Oh yeah, we have that. We won the Hart from most valuable. It was twice the MVP. I'm sorry. And then that sort of late career. He didn't just come back for like 30 games. He came back for 3 seasons after having been retired for several years at that point, and presumably played well enough to at least be, getting shifts.
Yeah, even a guy like him, I'm sure if he was just downright terrible, somebody would have had a conversation with him and been like, look, the coach wouldn't have purposely brought him to Quebec. He would have been like, why don't you just stay here? Maybe. Couple of quick notes to close this. When he died earlier this year, they interviewed John Davidson, who was a goalie for the Rangers at around that time. And he said, when he got the puck at the blue line at the old Montreal Forum and headed up the ice, you could just feel the rush. You'd feel the people make noise, and that noise would get louder and louder, and the people would stand whether he scored or not. There are 4 Canadian players who are honored with statues outside of the Bell Center, which is where the team plays, and that's Rocket Richard, Howie Morenz, Dean Bellevue, and Guy LaFleur. So one of the all-time great players for one of the all-time great franchises in the history of the National Hockey League. Why don't we move on? And Andrew, do you want to tell us a little bit about our next honoree?
Sure. Bob Lanier, born in 1948, passed away on May 10th. An 8-time NBA All-Star, Lanier played in 14 seasons in the NBA for the Detroit Pistons and Milwaukee Bucks, both of whom have retired as number 16. Lanier is still the all-time Pistons leader in points per game. He was inducted into the Basketball Hall of Fame in 1992.
And we are glad to have with us back again the host of Basketball History 101 on the Sports History Network, Rick Loayza. And Rick, thank you again for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me back. I appreciate it.
No, glad you could do it. Really glad to have you be a part of it. So Bob Lanier, maybe not somebody that's well known among fans, but not a Kareem or a Wilt or one of these great centers of all time. What sort of would you say is the most important thing to know about Bob Lanier?
I think the thing with Bob Lanier, you're right that he's not in that elite category of center. He's probably maybe that second tier of Hall of Fame, and it's hard to say because he was legitimately a Hall of Fame center, but probably just kind of in that level, that tier below, Wilt and Kareem and Bill Russell and those guys. But I think what he did on the court, I think was significant in terms of just how he played. But unfortunately, he had to deal with some knee injuries right from his rookie year. But before we get into that, I think his biggest contributions, honestly, were after he retired from playing days. For the last, I think, about 20 years before he passed, he was one of the NBA's global ambassadors. In other words, he spent a lot of time promoting basketball around the world, here in the United States as well, just to put on clinics and get kids involved with playing basketball and just spreading the game around the world. And I think that was an enormous contribution on his part.
He was definitely a lifer, spent time as an assistant coach. He was actually interim head coach of the Golden State Warriors for a part of a season after Don Nelson was either let go, or I don't know exactly what the story was there.
Yeah, Don Nelson got fired.
Did Nelson get fired? And I think he got hired by the Knicks the following offseason, which ended up being a disaster. But yeah, so he was a guy who was around. Unfortunately for him, I think he really played on a couple of really bad franchises. He was on the Pistons early in his career on some teams that made the playoffs a little bit, but were not very good. And then had some better luck in the 80s with Milwaukee. I think they made the Eastern Conference Finals a couple of years, and they were decent. And then, like you said, he went on to this great career, a great life afterwards, sort of being an ambassador for the league and for the sport and kind of spreading the gospel of basketball throughout the world. But a guy who unfortunately gets kind of lost in the shuffle a little bit because there's not a lot of moments there that you can really point to as great seasons, great games, that type of thing. So, yeah,
the thing with any player, regardless of whether it's basketball, football, hockey, baseball, what have you, people remember those clutch moments, and typically that means playing in the conference finals, playing in the finals, in the NBA finals, and having those moments where you make a big shot, like whether it's a Robert Horry draining that three against the Kings or something of that level. And unfortunately, Lanier never really got the opportunity to play in those big games because he was on weaker teams, and it's no fault of his own. I mean, the guy went to the All-Star game, as you said, 8 times. But he was just on weak teams. When he was on the Pistons, this is way before Isaiah and Joe Dumars and those bad boy Pistons. None of those guys were all still in high school and middle school at the time. And you're right. In Milwaukee, he gets some more, a little bit better teams, but again, just not strong enough. He was never in a situation where he had a lot of talent around him. And that's unfortunate because as great as these guys are, at the end of the day, I think it's a team sport, and you got to have a complete team. You got to have offense, defense, and all 5 of your positions pretty much settled if you're going to go deep. And he never had that.
I said that he made it to 2 Eastern Conference Finals. I think it might have only actually been 1, and that was in his very last year in 83, 84. Maybe the best team that he ever played on, coached by the aforementioned Don Nelson, 50-win team, wins the Central Division, and they make it to the NBA Finals, or to the Eastern Conference Finals against the Celtics, lose in 5 games. And this is a team with Sidney Moncrief and Paul Pressey, and Lanier is the starting center in his last year in the league. So never really gets a big moment, but he's well known in NBA history for a couple of things. His shoes, he had big feet, somewhere in the 18 to 19, maybe some have even said over 20 size range. So there are bronze models of his shoes. I don't know if they're bronze models or the actual shoes in the Basketball Hall of Fame, but his shoes are on display at the Basketball Hall of Fame in Springfield. So he's well known for that. And then another interesting anecdote that I had was that in a game, once he was traded from Detroit to the Bucks in a game against the Pistons, he gets so angry at Bill Laimbeer that he just hauls off and slugs Bill Laimbeer. And that is the reason that the Pistons don't retire his jersey until the early 90s because they're mad at him that he slugged Bill Laimbeer in a game. The Bucks retire his jersey almost immediately after he retires, but the Pistons make him wait because they're angry that he probably deservedly hauled off and punched Bill Laimbeer.
I thought that was interesting because he only went to 1 All-Star game with Milwaukee, and then the other 7 he went to while he was a Piston. And you're right. Milwaukee retires his number practically the day he retires. Pistons wait on it, and I thought good for him because I'm sure Laimbeer deserved it. Whatever the reason that Lanier slugged him. But yeah, those size. I have seen those shoes. I've been to the Hall of Fame a couple of times, and he does have. I think it's officially a size 22 sneaker. That is on display, and so you can kind of compare. You can compare your own shoe next to his and see what it is. And it's interesting because his feet were so enormous, and it's still the record. I think Shaq came very, very close. Shaq's sneakers are like just within a hair of Bob Lanier's. But when he was in middle school, because his feet were even large as a kid. The middle school coach told him that you'll never make it as an athlete. Your feet are too big. You're going to be too clumsy. So much for that coach.
And he also is referenced in one of the more famous movie lines of all time, which I have to get in there for anyone who doesn't know. In the movie Airplane, which I believe came out in 1980, either 79 or 80. The joke is that the co-pilot is Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. And at first you don't know, are they stunt casting it or are they going to say, and basically there's also a relic of a previous time where there's a kid in the cockpit talking to the pilot, which is its own story. And he goes, wait a minute, you're Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. And he's like, no, my name is Roger. I'm the co-pilot, blah, blah, blah. He's like, no, you're Kareem. We saw you play. My dad says you're really lazy and you only try hard unless it's the playoffs. And finally Kareem snaps and he goes, listen, kid, I've been hearing that crap since I was at UCLA. You tell your old man to drag Walton and Lanier up the floor for 48 minutes a night. So that's one of the enduring Legacies, Bob Lanier, that he's mentioned that famous airplane scene. So.
Yeah, I love that scene. That kid is, I mean, the kid was so scared after he let him go.
His years in Detroit, or at least his last year, a couple of years in Detroit, he plays under Dick Vitale, which does not go well. Vitale, not a good NBA coach. I think he lasts a season and then like another 10 games. Bill Simmons, again, I quoted him in his book of basketball a little earlier. He said that we remember Lanier for his tough lefty hook, his sneaky fall away, those giant sneakers, and how he replaced Willis Reed as the league's premier, quote, "I'm a nice guy, but if you cross me, I will beat the living tar out of you in front of everyone" center. So he was definitely a force to be reckoned with in his time and a Hall of Famer.
Yeah, for sure. He's a guy that everybody liked. He was definitely a competitor, but everybody liked Lanier. Like, he was just a good dude. The one thing I did want to say to talk about is his rookie year. So his senior year at St. Bonaventure in college, he leads the team to the Final Four, but he's not able to play in the Final Four because he injures his knee. Mm-hmm. So he has to sit out. His team loses. And going into his rookie year, his knee probably wasn't where it should have been in that rookie, but the coach wants him to play because he's the number one draft pick. Got drafted number one overall in 1970. And so he plays on a knee that's not fully healed. And in retrospect, they look at that season and think that's probably why he suffered so many knee issues throughout his career. If he had taken the rookie year off, kind of like Blake Griffin or Ben Simmons, or like one of these guys that ends up missing their entire rookie year, that if he had done that and allowed his knee to really heal properly, he might have been able to perform at a little bit higher level. But I mean, in the 1970s, it was just different. You played hurt, and I think it just caused some long-term issues that he could have avoided.
But he was still a great player and still a great man.
Oh, for sure.
Rick, you joined us earlier for Bill Fitch. You joined us now for Bob Lanier. We really appreciate you joining us. And thanks again. And everybody check out Basketball History 101 on the Sports History Network.
Yep. Thank you, guys. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Rick.
Thanks, Rick.
Take care.
All right. See you guys.
Yep.
Bye.
All right. Well, let's move on to another sport and another legend and another guest appearance from a fellow podcast host on the Sports History Network. And we're going to talk about Hugh McElhenny, who was born in 1928 and died on June 17th. Nicknamed the King, McElhenny was part of the 49ers' $1 million backfield of the 1950s. McElhenny was named All-Pro in his first 2 years in the NFL and was a 6-time Pro Bowler during his career. He was previously an All-American at the University of Washington and still holds the single-game Huskies rushing record with 296 yards against Washington State in 1950. And we are lucky to be joined by the man who's probably dove into more football history over the last 3 years of the Sports History Network, Darin Hayes, who is the host of the Pigskin Dispatch, among many other endeavors on the Sports History Network, and he's here to talk to us a little bit about Hugh McElhenny. Darin, good to see you again, and thanks so much for doing this.
Hey, Dan and Andrew, thank you for having me on. This is always a pleasure to do. This is a great thing that you do to recognize these great athletes and sports figures at the end of the year. Especially maybe when people are missing them the most, so good job.
Thank you. So what is it about, what can you tell us about Hugh McElhenny? What made him special?
Well, I came across an article of doing some research a couple years ago about him, because I didn't really know much about him a couple years ago. I knew he played for the 49ers and, he was great in his era, but he was such a humble guy, and his roots of being an athlete were very interesting to me, and it really made me connect to him. And maybe when I share it with you and the listeners, maybe it helps you connect to what a great guy this guy was.
Absolutely. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, he grew up in the Los Angeles area. He was born on New Year's Eve of 1928, which I found was kind of interesting. And you mentioned he was nicknamed the King. Well, newspaper writers over the years through his collegiate, his high school, and professional career, they called him, besides the King, Hurryin' Hugh, Hustlin' Hugh, and Hurricane Hugh. Sort of gives you an impression the guy was pretty gifted and pretty fast. So
also shows you that having an H is a good name back then for nickname.
Yeah, that could be too. Yeah,
Exactly.
That could be too. But a lot of them have to do with the speed and everything he's got. And he was a track star in high school. That's really where he got his name. He ended up setting high school records and state records in the low hurdles and the broad jump, and ran the 100-yard dash in 9.8 seconds. And he won both the hurdles and a long jump in the 1947 California state meet for where they had all the greatest athletes of that state in high school. He was recruited by just about every college there was. His father was sort of acting as his agent, which probably most fathers did back in that era. But he had a little bit of an issue. He was missing a foreign language, and so no major colleges would accept him. So he ended up going to a JUCO college local to LA, Compton Community College, Compton Junior College. And played football there for a year. Great season. Had a 105-yard kickoff return for a touchdown, a game played against the University of Mexico. And he was the centerpiece of Compton's undefeated football team in 1948 that won the Junior Rose Bowl. Yeah, I found that kind of surprising, too. They had a Rose Bowl for the junior colleges for about a 20-year span. Played in Pasadena. And they won it. He was considered one of the best players in football at any level at that junior college. As a matter of fact, Heisman Trophy winner Tom Harmon remarked in a paper one time after seeing him play that, quote, he had never seen such a combination of speed and size. And Harmon had both of those when he played. His reputation was on fire. So him and a buddy drove around by car to as many colleges as they could, having sort of that road trip that you want to do when we all dreamed about when we're in college. And, everybody was banging at his door. Before he committed to anybody, he got to play in a Los Angeles All-Star game called the Milk Bowl, where they raised some money for kids for milk that were less fortunate. And a writer there for the LA Times, Dick Hyland, described him as this. It said, his cutbacks, fakes, and feints and changes of pace were bits of sure physical, poetic beauty. And ended up, there was pro scouts at that high school all-star game and when he was at Compton. And they included the Los Angeles Dons of the AAFC, San Francisco 49ers, the New York Yankees, and the Pittsburgh Steelers and Chicago Cardinals from the NFL were all there when he was in a junior college. He ended up having the honor of playing in the International Amateur Football Federation tournament when he represented the U.S. red, white, and blue team against Hawaii. And he was sort of the featured player there. He didn't have the greatest of games, but it just gave more renown for him. And he ended up, his father and him ended up agreeing that he play for University of Washington, and that's where he went and played his major football at. So just impressed me, all these things that he did to promote himself, but he really promoted himself on the field with his great athleticism.
A couple of the things that I found, first of all, he was such a good player that the 49ers actually tried to convince him to forego college, not even go to college, and sort of join the pros right off. And that's something you think of as a phenomenon of, first of all, not football. And second of all, the 80s and 90s, not the late 40s, early 50s. In the mid 40s, he trained for the decathlon. He trained in London, or he didn't. I don't know if he tried the sentence I saw. It said he trained for the decathlon in London. I don't know if he was training for London or training in London, but the 48 Olympics was held in London, England. And he actually beat Bob Mathias in several events. Bob Mathias, who ended up representing the U.S. in the Olympics, in the decathlon, and winning the gold medal. So, like you said, just a tremendous all-around athlete. He was probably at his best in the NFL as a kick returner. He was a good sort of running back, pass catcher out of the backfield type of guy. Bob St. Clair, who was a fellow 49er of the 50s and a teammate, another Hall of Famer, said that McElhenny had sort of a Barry Sanders type of game, sort of quick cuts, running. They said that, he ran for X number of yards in his career, but probably covered 3 times as much difference with the running back and forth, trying to gain those yards, which is very similar to a Barry Sanders type thing. Never rushed for 1,000 yards in a season. He was part of these 49er teams who, sort of like the 49ers of the early 70s, were good teams, but never really got over that hump. He came to the 49ers in 1952 in the NFL, made all pro his first 2 years, and then a couple years later made a couple more Pro Bowls, but they were always kind of decent, 7-5, 9-3, 7-4-1. The only playoff appearance he gets in is in 1957 when they lose to the Lions, the eventual world champions, 31-27 in the Western Conference Finals. So not a guy who did a lot of winning in his career, but he was part of this great backfield that was called the $1 million backfield with 2 other Hall of Famers, Y.A. Tittle and Joe Perry, and then John Henry Johnson was the other running back. So 3 of those 4 guys are in the Professional Football Hall of Fame. And
I think John Henry Johnson's in the Hall of Fame also.
Is he really?
Yeah, he went on to play for the Steelers in 1960 and ended up making the Hall of Fame.
Is that correct? Let me.
Yep.
Not that
he is in the Hall of Fame.
Oh, well, shows
the whole backfield was in the Hall of Fame.
Whole backfield in the Hall of Fame, all 4 of them. That's crazy.
49ers $1 million backfield is currently the only full house backfield to have all 4 of its members enshrined in the Hall of Fame. I like how they say currently. Well, I guess if there's one with 3 and maybe they put the 4th one in, I don't think there's going to be a modern day resurgence of the full house backfield. It puts 4 guys in the Hall of Fame, although football is cyclical. We never know. But yep, he was also Johnson was also a member of the Steelers Legends team, which honors the franchise's best players pre-1970. So that, yes, he is a Hall of Famer as well.
Oh, no, I'll be darned. That shows what I know. McElhenny's reputation was one. I think the King really kind of fit who he was. He was revered. There's a story, Jerry Kramer, the great Hall of Fame guard for the Packers, in one of his books talks about being a rookie in 1958 and in a preseason game being on the kickoff team against the 49ers, and they kick it off to McElhenny. And he says as he's running down the field in this preseason game, he says, "Here I am, just some kid from Idaho, and I'm going to try and tackle the King." So he did have that reputation among the public and among his fellow players in the late 1950s. Finishes out his career kind of all over the place, a year or 2 with the Vikings. He finishes up with the Lions. And Andrew, I don't know if you're aware, you probably are. He plays in 1963 on that last Giant team to make it to the NFL title game, sort of the last good Giant team for 18, 19 years. He reunites with Tittle, and Gifford's there, and Alex Webster and Del Schaffner. So he's very much a role player, but does kind of finally make it to an NFL title game in 63 with the Giants.
Yeah, he was drafted by he was taken by the Vikings in 61 and they were in the expansion draft. So he was on the Vikings in their initial couple of years in 61 and 62. He described his time with them as a dead end street because he was an aging running back. They were rebuilding or not. They were, building for the future, obviously weren't planning on contending right away, especially as they found out that they were going to be sharing a division with the budding dynasty in Green Bay. But he ended up spending a year with the Giants. Said it was something to the effect of, "It's great to be on a winner." He was basically shot by then. His knees were gone. He wasn't able to do too much, but he was able to sort of do a little bit here and there. That 63 Giants team lost in the NFL championship game to the Bears, and then one more year with Detroit, and that was it. When he retired, he was 3rd all time in all-purpose yards. He had 11,375 all-purpose yards, third when he retired after the 64 season.
And I also saw that until 1998, he had the 3 longest runs in 49er history.
Yeah, that's true. He's still, I was looking it up, he's still the 129th on the list of career NFL rushers, even with his 5,800 some yards rushing. So, dude, that's still pretty respectable for if you think about all those backs ahead of him.
Not bad for a guy who never ran for more than 1,000 yards in a season. In 1952, his rookie year, he averaged 7 yards a carry, which is pretty good in any era too.
Yeah, and I just wanted to go ahead. Sorry, Darin.
Oh, no, not a problem. The thing that really caught me, this is a story I want to share with you guys. When he first left Washington and became a pro, he shared the story in September 4th with the Seattle Post-Intelligencer. So he's a little bit older when he's telling the story. He said he actually made more money in college, and he admitted illegally some of the money he got in college, that him and his wife together were making like 10 grand when his senior year in college. When he goes to the 49ers, she has to quit her job. He's only making 7 grand with the 49ers. And I just thought, the honesty of this guy who's a legend, it could be besmirching his great legendary status, but I respect him more for being honest about it. And it's just a whole different era, and it's interesting.
Yeah, it was in 2004. I guess he finally, after decades of denying it, said, "Yeah, I got improper benefits while I was there." That was the thing I was going to say is. That's one of my favorite jokes of all time. I've heard it for more modern players, but he might be one of the first ones they ever made that joke about, that he took a pay cut when he went to the NFL. And he admitted that as a rookie, it was basically true. So, it was a different time. And I don't think that makes you a bad or even dishonest person, but it's just kind of a funny button on the story that, for decades he denied it. And I guess by 2004, 60 years after he left college, he figured, there's probably not much they can do to me now. So I'll just admit it.
I have a book here on the $1 Million backfield that was written in 2000. So almost 20 years ago. And
you had it already?
What do you mean?
Did you buy it for this, or you had it already?
No, I had it already.
Figured. Go ahead.
I don't buy books for the podcast. I just scan the bookshelf, and there's usually one there, unfortunately. And the author talks about how McElhenny he had to just take constant cigarette breaks during the interview. So even in his early 70s, he was continuing to smoke. I don't know if quit at some point, but either way, it didn't hurt him. He lived until 93, and he was one of the oldest living Hall of Famers at the time of his death. He was not the oldest, and in fact, a little bit later on, we're going to talk about Charlie Trippi, who was over 100 and died this year, who had been the oldest living Hall of Famer. I want to close Pat Summerall when questioned about Hugh McElhenny, says, "My memories of McElhenny are punt returns, kickoff returns, long runs. He's one of those players that when you look across the line of scrimmage, you better be sure you know where he is at all times. He was scary. The closest thing to him I've seen is Gale Sayers, incidentally, who Darin came on to talk with me about a couple years ago. I have this one picture of McElhenny running down the field and pointing out to his blockers which guys to block." And then Summerall says, "I could see McElhenny today in a role like Marshall Faulk, an every down back coming out of the backfield, running and receiving. You'd want him to have as many carries as possible, but you'd worry if he could hold up. Like most thoroughbreds, they do get hurt." And I think, as we talked about, he suffers from some bad knees and that type of thing later in his career. So Hugh the King McElhenny, one of the greats of all time in San Francisco 49er history. Before we sign off here or end this segment, Darin, you are the host of the Pigskin Dispatch as well as some other endeavors on the Sports History Network. I know right now you're in the middle of a segment, or a series, I should say, on the Rose Bowl. Do you want to just tell us a little bit about what you're up to these days on the network?
Yeah, well, we have 40 days of Rose Bowl history. We have 40 straight days of podcasts. There's probably 50 or 60 podcasts altogether. Some days there's multiples coming out. We have a bunch of historians and authors coming on talking about a lot of the games and different aspects of the Rose Bowl Stadium because it turns 100 years in January 2023. The stadium does. And just have some great conversations and it's just some great football history just talking about that one game. And you don't realize how much has actually happened in that game until you start looking at some of these and some of the great players that played in it. So we're having a blast doing that.
And you've also been involved with our first sort of fictional drama on the network, Orville Mulligan. You want to tell everybody a little bit about that?
Yeah, Orville Mulligan Sports Writer is the name of it, and it's on your favorite podcast providers. And myself and Oz Davis of Truly the Goats has teamed up, and we've started this project a little over a year ago, and we wrote a fictional character of Orville Mulligan in the 1920s, and he's going around to all these great events. This first season, we have him in the season of 1924, in the fall of 1924. So you have, the Four Horsemen of Notre Dame, you have Ernie Nevers, you have World Series going to Game 7. We have some boxing, we have some wrestling, we have a lot of different sports of that era. And we're capturing actual historic events through this fictional character, and there's some great storylines. So I think it's something that everybody can enjoy of any age, and it's kind of entertaining. The great actors on it too, by the way, they're excellent.
Absolutely. And we always enjoyed spending some time with you, Darin. About a year ago, Andrew and I, when Darin was doing another one of his long-term projects on his show, he did the 10 best players at each number in NFL history, and Andrew and I we were on a ton of them. I think we did like 9 or 10. So
you might have done a few more than me. I don't think I did 9, but I think I only did
one. I think I only did one more than you. Okay, maybe we did like 6 or 7. We did a bunch though. We did quite a few.
Yeah, you guys.
Oh yeah, it was fun.
Yeah, you guys were regulars. I had to give you a time card.
Well, Warren Rogan stole a lot of the giant numbers that I wanted, so we had to compromise a little bit. But still, it was a lot of fun. Well, Darin, we always enjoy having you. We always enjoy listening and following everything you do on the network, whether it's with Orville Mulligan or the Pigskin Dispatch or some of the other work you've done with sports jerseys. And it's really been a blast getting to know you these last few years. So Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays to you and your family, and we appreciate you joining us.
Yeah, same to you guys. I appreciate you, and thank you, and have great holidays with your family, and stay safe.
Thank you. All right, so thanks to Darin for talking to us about Hugh McElhenny, and we are going to move on and speak with another colleague at the Sports History Network about another NFL legend, and that is Marlin Briscoe, who was born in 1945 and passed away on June 27th. The first black starting quarterback in modern professional football, Briscoe threw 14 touchdown passes for the Denver Broncos in 1968. He later converted to wide receiver and won 2 Super Bowls with the Miami Dolphins in the 1970s. When we go through and do these, when I go through and put these lists together with Andrew's feedback and input, sort of the general rule that I have is anybody who is a Hall of Famer from the 3 major sports, and anybody who is a Hall of Famer in the NHL usually makes it on unless they're so obscure that I really don't think that Andrew or I would have much to say. Then we look at guys who sort of had big moments. We obviously have a little bit of a New York bent. And so if there's, we'll talk about Ralph Terry, or actually we will have already spoken about Ralph Terry, who was a pitcher for the Yankees in the 60s. So it's mostly Hall of Famers, but also record setters, guys with key moments. And then obviously we can get into if there's key figures in other sports, boxing, tennis, golf. We'll go outside if there's somebody huge international in soccer. For the major 3, we do mostly Hall of Famers, but occasionally we will sort of delve deeper into somebody. And Marlin Briscoe, as one of the first black quarterbacks in modern professional football, as well as just sort of an interesting story, plus the fact that he was a Pro Bowler at another position and won a couple of Super Bowls with the Miami Dolphins, including the undefeated team. For all of those reasons, I thought that even though he's not somebody who's in the Hall of Fame, would be a good person to talk a little bit about here. And so Andrew and I are glad to have Dana Auguster from the Historically Speaking Sports podcast back with us. And so Dana, you were on with us a little earlier to speak about Charlie Taylor. And why don't you tell us a little bit about what made you want to come on and talk about Marlin Briscoe?
Well, first off, thank you for having me back on. I really appreciate it. Marlin Briscoe was someone that, as someone who actually in junior high played quarterback, had never, and I've always was interested in African-American quarterbacks, me being African-American myself, and playing quarterback for a very short time. Unfortunately, that's another story for another day. But he was someone who I never really heard of until I got into my 20s. And it was a book that I had read called Third and Long. And I can't remember who wrote the book, but it was Third and Long. It's basically the exploration of black quarterbacks through pro football, and that's when I heard about Marlin Briscoe, the first black starting quarterback to start on a consistent basis in pro football. And he played for the Broncos and was the quarterback for only one season. And there are two things about him that is remarkable. One, he still holds the record for the Broncos as the most touchdown passes by a rookie. He has 14 touchdown passes in 1968, which is still a Broncos rookie record, even more than John Elway, believe it or not. John Elway in 83 only threw 7 touchdown passes that his first year. Marlin Briscoe doubled that. And secondly, he was the subject, and he was actually the namesake of a fictional high school in a Nike commercial in the early 2000s. If you remember, there was this song that Nike had this campaign in the early 2000s called Football is Everything. And this Nike commercial was this fictional high school. Michael Vick was there, LT, Brian Urlacher. Don Shula was the coach of this fictional high school. Jimmy Johnson was in the commercial playing a history teacher. And you had all of these NFL stars. And the coaching staff, they showed us this scene in the locker room where Don Shula is giving the team a pregame pep talk. And the coaches was, Urban Meyer was an assistant, yet the other assistant was actually Marlin Briscoe.
Oh, wow.
The actual Marlin Briscoe was one of the assistant coaches. And the name of the school was Marlin Briscoe High School. So he came to prominence post-career somewhat in a very obscure way. So I think that was really cool on their part to do that. Like I said, he was the first black quarterback in pro football to start on a consistent basis with the Denver Broncos and would later go on to be a wide receiver with the Buffalo Bills. And later on, like you said, with the Miami Dolphins, and won 2 Super Bowl rings with the Dolphins as a receiver opposite of Paul Warfield and Howard Twilley. But with the Broncos, with him at quarterback, and again, I love to compare current guys to guys from back in the day. If you would imagine Marlin Briscoe, he's kind of like a cross between Russell Wilson and Lamar Jackson. That's what he was like. If you ever watch film of him with him playing when he was playing the quarterback for the Broncos, wearing number 15, he was just this guy that would just take off running and was just extremely accurate downfield. So he had a talent. Lou Saban, the coach of the Broncos, said himself, it didn't matter whether you were red, black, pink, or blue. Here was a talent. And this talent was the type of talent that electrified the fans, which they desperately needed in Denver at that time, because this was right before Floyd Little became the running back. As things turned out, he only stayed in Denver for 1 year and played quarterback just for that 1 year.
And I think your point about the Broncos is sort of a good one. They were kind of a joke when the AFL started. Everybody, and even just, and Andrew and I talked about this a couple months ago when we did our NFL expansion league and team episode, and we talked about how the Broncos were kind of a symbol to a lot of NFL fans and NFL people of what a joke the AFL was, because they had these sort of bright orange uniforms with the striped socks and everything. And they were not good for most of the 60s. Meanwhile, you had teams like Kansas City, Oakland, Buffalo, even the Jets, even the Patriots, but the Broncos never really very good in the 1960s. And I was just looking just right on the Wikipedia page for the 68 Broncos, and it says that the team during this year threatened to relocate to Atlanta, Chicago, and Birmingham, Alabama. So there was really some serious talk of the Broncos leaving. So to get an exciting player like that, like you said before the Floyd Little days, Floyd Little, incidentally, who I believe we covered on an In Memoriam a couple of years ago.
2 years ago, yeah.
I think he died in 2020. So that was interesting. The funny thing I found, and you saw sort of a complimentary comment from Lou Saban. I found in my research that he kind of had a little bit of a conflict with Saban, and that was why he only stayed there for the 1 year. Now, the interesting and somewhat ironic piece of that is that he leaves the Denver Broncos, goes to Buffalo, and then a couple of years ago, they hire Lou Saban. And so he's got another conflict with the same coach. And he had sort of transitioned to receiver by that point, and that was where he ended up in Miami and then actually closed out his career with the New England Patriots. Had one season where he played for both Detroit and San Diego, and then played one last full season in 76 with the Patriots, who in and of themselves, that 76 Patriots team was a good team. They were 11-3, kind of came out of nowhere and made the playoffs. Lost to Oakland by a field goal. So that was a good team that he played on at the end of his career. So a guy who played on a bunch of different teams in his career and was also one of the receivers, secondary, obviously, to Paul Warfield, who wouldn't have been, but he was a member of that undefeated 72 Dolphin team. One of the things that we've talked about, and I know I'm getting a little long-winded here, and this maybe isn't specific to Briscoe, but you start to see, and it's very sad, you start to see some of these guys from these teams start to die off. So like basically the Yankee dynasty of the 50s and 60s is basically gone. There's a few guys that are still around, but it's basically gone. And we'll get into one of these in a big way in a minute here. But how many guys have been lost from the Auerbach Celtics over the last few years? How many guys have been lost from the Lombardi Packers over the last couple of years? And I think, unfortunately, we're going to start to see that more with these 70s teams also, whether it's the Steel Curtain or these 70s Dolphins. So that's something I think it's also worth noting with Briscoe, is that a guy who was a key part of what many people consider to be the best single season team in the history of professional football. And some of these guys are getting older and starting to pass away.
Yeah, that's right. Going back to Briscoe, and you talked about the incident with Lou Saban in the 69 season, which would have been his second season. Saban had intended to start Pete Lisk at quarterback and then have Steve Tinsey as the backup. Briscoe was like, no, I don't want to be a part of this. If I'm going to be, I negotiated to be a quarterback, and I've led the Broncos, excited the fans and all of this, so I deserve at least a shot. And Lou Saban, for whatever reason, wouldn't grant that wish. So he decided to move on to Buffalo. And Buffalo was an interesting situation as well, because they already had a black quarterback on staff, which was Harris, which is Shaq Harris from Grambling, which I know so much about because my godfather attended Grambling at the same time. James Harris was the quarterback there, and he was more of a prototypical quarterback at the time. He wasn't like Briscoe, because Briscoe was only like 5'10", 170 pounds, as opposed to James Shaq Harris was like 6'4". He was like the Cam Newton of the 60s. And they already had a quarterback there, and plus they had Jack Kemp, who was toward the end of his career, so you already had two quarterbacks there, including one of them was black. So I think that precipitated his move to become a wide receiver, and he was joined in the wide receiver room with Haven Moses, who would later become an All-Pro with the Broncos. And this is amazing why that team did not win more than what they did, because you had a young O.J. Simpson on that team, who was a rookie who was coming into his I think that was his rookie year, 69. And you had Haven Moses on one side, you had Marlin Briscoe on the other. I mean, these were athletes, and all you had to do is just get the ball. But for some reason, Buffalo just could not win, the post Jack Kemp era, in between, OJ becoming OJ in the early 70s. That was like the space and time in Buffalo where it just seemed like they were just a moribund franchise. And plus you had you in the same division with the New York Jets. And then later when the merger happens, you find yourself in the same division with the Colts, and, the Jets were still kind of good, and then the Dolphins were coming on. So they were just somewhat of a lost era for the Bills. And then plus the whole entire decade of the 70s, and of course Briscoe would move on to the Dolphins in time for the 72 perfect season. And incidentally, in 73, believe it or not, looking back on this, I didn't realize this. In 73, Briscoe was the leading receiver for the Dolphins. It wasn't Warfield.
Oh, wow.
He was the leading receiver for the Miami Dolphins that season. So it was, and he caught a key pass in Super Bowl 8 to set up a score for the Dolphins, I think in the first quarter. So Briscoe had one of his, it's not an obscure career, but he had a very interesting career with not a whole lot of fanfare, because, you got to remember this Dolphins team, you had the no-name defense, you had an offense that was pretty much predicated on the run. You had Warfield on one side, and you had Howard Twilley as a receiver, who is a really good possession type receiver, and Briscoe kind of got lost in the shuffle there. But his contributions as a member of the Broncos and having the ability to change positions to be a receiver was interesting, and is a story that needs to be told.
Absolutely. And yeah, you're right about them emphasizing the run. I looked at the stats. He didn't catch a single pass in the 72 playoffs. He did more in 73. He caught some passes in 73. Also, it's worth noting that in 69, in that huddle in Buffalo, you had a quarterback who was a future U.S. congressman and vice presidential candidate in Jack Kemp. You had the first black quarterback in modern football in Marlin Briscoe, and then you had O.J. Simpson, and O.J. Simpson is O.J. Simpson. So
right.
That's a very interesting huddle with the 69 Bills.
Something on Briscoe, and I didn't really realize this, but he was part of a very brief but very significant. Omaha had a bit of a moment in sports at this point. There's a quote from Johnny Rodgers, who won the Heisman in 1972 at Nebraska. And he said that he and his friends grew up looking up to Briscoe, Baseball Hall of Famer Bob Gibson, and Pro Football Hall of Famer Gale Sayers, all of whom were from Omaha. And the Rodgers quote is, "We did know them, and because we did see them going further, it gave us hope that we could go further too. That paved the way." So all black athletes, all from Omaha, Nebraska, coming in, obviously Gibson and Sayers are on a little bit of a different level, but, rising to prominence at roughly the same time.
Yeah, that's interesting. That I did not know. I knew that Sayers and they were all from Nebraska. Johnny Rodgers was from Omaha. I knew all of that. But as far as them looking up to Briscoe, and that makes sense. That really makes sense, because here's a guy that's playing quarterback in pro football at a time when you didn't see Hart at all, didn't see black quarterbacks at all. So seeing him would give a young athlete I could play this position, and right around that same time in Kansas City, you had your first black middle linebacker in Willie Lanier. So there was a groundbreaking era in pro sports. And of course it was in the AFL, which was already known for being groundbreaking racially for a number of different ways. You had your first black scout in Lloyd Wells at Kansas City. You have a lot of different things that happened to break down those walls of racism, and the AFL was the forerunner of all of that.
I know we're going a little long here, but that's kind of the thing I think that gets lost a little in people's sanitizing of history. It wasn't Jackie Robinson signed in 1947 and Pee Wee Reese put his arm around him and suddenly there was no more racism in sports. I mean, I've read a book about baseball in 1954, and almost every team was integrated by then, except the Yankees and the Red Sox and a couple other ones. But there was sort of this soft cap of 4 or 5, any more than that's pushing it. And then, 10 years later, it was, you're not going to see a black pitcher. You're not going to see a black quarterback. You're not going to see, at certain positions. And then obviously it became head coaches, general managers, still an issue we're dealing with today. But being a black quarterback in the 60s was considered a trailblazing thing, because
right,
there were legitimately things out there. Well, they're not smart enough to play the position. And that's obviously, in hindsight, gross and wrong. But that was the prevailing wisdom at the time that a quarterback had to get ahead of. So,
right.
Dana is going to actually stay right with us here to deal with our next person. But Well, sort of in between, Dana, why don't you take us a little bit to, or take it a little bit, I should say, to tell us a little bit about your podcast, Historically Speaking Sports. And this is the podcast that I think is probably the most similar to ours on the network, in that you kind of any of the sports, any of the eras, different things. So tell us a little bit about what you do.
Well, on Historically Speaking Sports, I am a big sports history junkie, I guess you can call it. And it's not just in one sport or another. You know, somebody were to ask me, what's your favorite sport? I'd be like, the one that's going on right now.
Yeah, I'm kind of the same way.
And I recently did an interview with a lady by the name of Erin Grayson Sapp, who talked about, going back to the AFL. We just talked about the AFL boycott and walkout of the 1965 AFL All-Star Game in New Orleans. And she wrote a whole book about that. And it was a very, very interesting conversation about how that impacted the NFL going to New Orleans. The AFL really wanted a team in New Orleans, and they decided not to because of all of the racial incidents that happened in New Orleans leading up to that All-Star Game, where ultimately was moved to Houston at the last minute. And it was in New Orleans eventually got an NFL team a couple of years later with the Saints, obviously, and how that affected the decision to put a team there, and all of the ramifications that happened with the All-Star Game. So that was my most recent podcast release, and I have one working on right now. I have big plans in next, going into my third season or my third year in the league. I like to say, but I have a lot going on. What I have coming up next is this is the 40th anniversary of when I first really got into college football, 1982. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through and just do a brief synopsis of the 1982 bowl season, which is completely different from what you would see today. And it's sort of like a contrast and compare and contrast type of thing between bowl season of today, where they have 40 some bowl games, as opposed to 1982. I think they only had 17. And you really had to do something to get into a bowl game, not just show up. And I'm going through that. One of the games that's going to be talked about is the 1982 Liberty Bowl between Alabama and Illinois, which was Bear Bryant's final game as a head coach. So I'm going to talk about that. And that's coming up on my next show. And then next year is going to be year 3, which is also going to be my 50th year on this planet. So I have a lot going on in 83. I'm going to talk a little bit about that later on.
Just to correct you real quick, you did say something about the NFL putting a team in New Orleans with the Saints. New Orleans got the Saints long before they got an NFL team. It was about 20 years of that Saints team before they had an NFL.
So now you can't say that too loud. I'm from Louisiana. My wife is from Louisiana, and she is a big Saints fan. And I have a story about that, which is just hilarious. I will tell another time, but it's a funny story when it comes down to that. When it comes down to her and being a Saints fan.
So when I said before that our podcasts are very similar, this year was my 40th birthday, and it's not out yet, but it will be by the time you're hearing this, the previous one will have posted, because I'm almost done editing it. We did a 1982 episode where we sort of went through the whole thrust of all of the year in sports in 1982. I think we might have actually missed the fact that Bear Bryant coached his final game, but we were at 2.5 hours anyway, so it's not like we didn't miss much. But yeah, Dana, you've done everything from sort of more modern stuff. You've done all other interviews, but then you've also done kind of a lot of the fun kind of deep dives from way back, whether it was the Ray Chapman killed by a pitch, Miracle Braves 1914. So kind of like us, you have episodes that are more serious and have more of a larger historical importance, and then you have stuff that was just fun and that was just cool. And obviously that does not include the death of Ray Chapman. Right. That wasn't fun, but you know what I'm saying? Like us, and you did a lot of NBA 75 stuff, which I appreciated because we did that too. Great podcast. Check it out. I've guested on it once or twice as well. So, Dana, we really enjoy it. And, you're going to stick right with us here to talk about, maybe sort of the guy we might do more time on than anybody else on the list this year. Andrew, did you want to read our next name?
Bill Russell, born in 1934, died on July 31st. The winningest player in North American pro sports, Russell won 11 championships in 13 years, including 8 in a row as a star center with the Boston Celtics. He won 5 MVP awards and led the league in rebounding 4 times. Russell played the last 3 seasons of his career as the Celtics player coach and won NBA titles in 1968 and 1969. After his death, the NBA announced that they will retire Russell's number 6 throughout the league.
All right, so there are so many places that we can go with Bill Russell, and so I think maybe to start, we can defer to Dana, defer to our guest here, and wherever you want to take it with Bill Russell, and then Andrew and I will kind of pick up the ball from there.
Well, let's start off with a little known fact that I discovered while doing research about Bill Russell. We got to go all the way back to his high school career at McClymonds High School in Oakland. He was born in West Monroe, Louisiana, which, of course, being from Louisiana originally, that's kind of a cool thing. Mm-hmm. But he grew up in Oakland, California, and playing for McClymonds High School, which is a legendary basketball high school in Oakland. Do you know that future Hall of Fame baseball player Frank Robinson was his high school teammate?
I did not know that.
I didn't know that.
Frank Robinson was his high school basketball teammate at McClymonds High School during the early 1950s. And when he wasn't highly recruited out of high school, believe it or not, because at the time, of course, in the 50s basketball, power forwards and centers were prized for being scorers. You know, you had Mike at the time, and you had others. And they were primarily scorers, and that's what coaches were looking for, guys, centers and power forwards that could put the ball in the hoop. But, of course, Russell wasn't like that. So he wasn't really highly recruited right out of high school. He was more of a defensive player / rebounder, which he became legendary for doing his NBA career with the Boston Celtics. But he was recruited by the University of San Francisco and Phil Woolpert. And he was joined by Casey Jones, who would later become his teammate in Boston, but they were together at San Francisco, and they rattled off 55 consecutive wins, which was the longest winning streak in college basketball until UCLA came in the late 60s and early 70s and won 88 in a row with Bill Walton and the Walton gang. But he attended the University of San Francisco and led them to back-to-back national titles in 55 and 56. And then right after that, he won a gold medal in the 1956 Summer Games in Melbourne. So along with the 11 NBA championships that Bill Russell had won, he also has 2 national championships in college basketball and an Olympic gold medal. And he's tied with the most pro championships in North America, along with Maurice Richard of the Canadiens, who also won 11 Stanley Cups. So those two are like, when you talk about winners, Russell and Maurice Richard are like right up there. It's like the greatest winners. But I think Russell has an edge because of winning 2 national championships in college basketball and an Olympic gold medal.
Yeah, I had not realized Richard had the full 11, and not to keep going back to previous. We actually talked about his brother, Henry Richard, in 2020 as well. The one that I always think of, too, that's sort of in that same stratosphere is Yogi Berra, who had 10.
That's right.
So that's kind of that whole group. But you're right, Russell, in addition to the fact that he did it in college, did it in the Olympics, the last couple he was a coach as well, and so won it as a coach. And Andrew, refresh my memory, wasn't that San Francisco team, didn't they play LaSalle in a national championship game?
That's right, they did.
Here, I was going to get to that. So in 54, LaSalle won the national championship. Tom Gola, still the all-time NCAA leading rebounder, was their best player. And then in 55, they were back and they were in the championship game. And that was Russell's first one they lost. It was sort of considered the battle of Tom Gola, who'd been the best player the last few years, and Bill Russell, who was obviously on his way. And I won't, not to frame this all with LaSalle, but I have I have a book here written. We've interviewed the author on here, but it's about Tom Gola, and just like a little quick anecdote. The Final Four was in Kansas City. So this is Kansas City, Missouri in 1955. It says, a day prior to the championship game in Kansas City, the LaSalle team went to see a movie after their final practice. I was the first one up at the box office and they wouldn't let me in. This is Ralph Lewis, the one black player on the LaSalle team at the time. I hailed a cab and told the driver, take me to the black pool room. I got to the pool room, and inside were Bill Russell, Casey Jones, and the other San Francisco players. We played a couple of 8-ball games, and then obviously the next day they played, and it was Russell and San Francisco were the better team as they had been all year and beat LaSalle. Yeah, that's sort of how, that's my perspective, obviously 30 years before I was born, but they stopped my alma mater from having a chance at a back-to-back championship in the 50s on the way to their own back-to-back championship.
Just to sort of do the on the court a little bit, he and Magic to me are the two guys who I feel like could dominate a game in NBA history without scoring a point. Magic obviously could do it passing. Russell could do it with blocking, his rebounding. The thing that I was always struck by with Russell was the fact that he sort of pioneered. I think he even said this, which was basically blocking the ball, knocking it into the seats wasn't going to do anybody any good. He would block a shot in a way that it would get the fast break started. And he also really was a keen student of the psychology of defense. And he talked about how he'd be guarding an opposing player. And one game he made sure that he blocked the guy's first 5 or 6 shots of the game. And he said that wasn't easy. Even for Bill Russell, blocking 6 shots in a row, that's not easy. That takes a lot of physical effort. But he said, I did that and I expended that energy at the beginning of the game just so I would know that this guy psychologically was not going to be a factor for the rest of the game. Bill Simmons, in his book of basketball, talks about Russell and some of his benefit. He said Russell had more value in the 60s. Everyone played run and gun, and every basket only counted for 2 points. So a rebounder / shot blocker was the biggest commodity you could have. Now it's a slash and kick game driven by perimeter stars. But then when everybody was running, it was a lot of fast breaks. It was guards. Is there maybe a better combination of two guys offensively and defensively, but especially offensively than Bill Russell and Bob Cousy? Russell blocking the ball and getting it to this sort of pioneering fast point guard in Bob Cousy. And Cousy retired, I think, 63. So the first several championships were won with Russell. So he is really like nothing else that's been seen before or since on the court in the NBA.
I mean, the only you could maybe, if you squint your eyes tight enough, you could see something of that similar in the 80s with Magic and Kareem as doing sort of the same thing. But of course, Russell and Cousy pioneered it. Russell would block a shot. And I remember one time I listened right after he passed. I had heard an interview that he did on NPR and how he described blocking a shot and what are the things that went into blocking a shot. And he went into detail that whenever you shoot a basket, whenever you shoot a ball, you don't jump as high as you can. You don't, because if you do, you're going to overshoot the basket. You jump into a way that you could just hit the basket. You don't jump with everything you got. Russell knew this. With his long arms as a defender, you can jump as high as you can because you ain't there's no muscular involvement into blocking the shot other than just flicking it away. But with a shooter, you don't jump as high as you can because you're going to miss, and he used that information. He used that knowledge and he used that fact to block as many shots as he has. If you look back at some of his records in the finals that still stand to this day, it's almost like it's ridiculous. I mean, it's ridiculous. I wrote some of them down, and it's unbelievable. He once had 51 rebounds in a single game. Okay, he has the most postseason rebounds, averaging 25 rebounds per game in the playoffs. He has 15 consecutive postseason games with at least 20 rebounds. And he played in 10 game sevens. And I'm going to talk about one particular game 7 in a minute, but that just proves to you and shows you that shot blocking and rebounding was a commodity and still is, especially when you get down into the postseason where the games start to slow down. And he was the key to that great Celtic fast break with Cousy kicking it out to, guys like Tommy Heinsohn and Satch Sanders and Casey Jones and Sam Jones. That was, and later John Havlicek. Those were that was the ignition switch, so to speak, of the famed Celtic break of the 1960s.
He was 10-0 in deciding games. So that would be, a game 7 or a game 5 in a 5-game series. 10-0. The only major series they ever lost was the 58 NBA Finals to Bob Pettit and the Hawks, and that was a 6-game series. So
that's right.
You mentioned some stats.
I feel like we should also mention he's a part of one of the great sort of individual rivalries, comparisons, whatever, on the level with Magic and Bird, Peyton Manning and Tom Brady. I'm sure there's a million more, but
Williams.
Yeah, his rivalry with Wilt Chamberlain, and just, both excellent players, but obviously very different in terms of abilities, games. Russell sort of, Russell being considered the consummate winner, Chamberlain probably unfairly being knocked as a guy who, should have won a lot more because of Russell winning all of those. That just sort of a very enduring, whatever you want to call it, rivalry, adversarial, whatever, on the court, the Bill Russell, Wilt Chamberlain thing.
You cannot have two guys that are rivals more different, both personality-wise and the way that the public looked at them and stature. Bill Russell was 6'9", 6'10", maybe. Wilt Chamberlain was 7'1" and outweighed Russell by like 60 pounds. Wilt Chamberlain, of course, was one of the most dominant basketball players in the history of the league. I mean, you come up with some outrageous offensive stat that somebody nowadays have done. He's only the second person to have done this, and the other person was Wilt Chamberlain. He did it in 1965, something like that. And, Wilt Chamberlain was way ahead of his time. But the thing that a lot of people don't really talk about when you talk about the Russell Chamberlain rivalry was that they were very, very good friends off the court. There was one particular story I heard once where I think it was Christmas, and the Celtics were playing in Philly. It was the Warriors back then. They hadn't moved to San Francisco, but they were still the Philadelphia Warriors. They were both relatively early in their career. And the game was on Christmas, and the game was on Christmas afternoon, like 1 o'clock in the afternoon. After the game, Russell goes to Chamberlain's house, actually his mother's house, for Christmas dinner. And Russell actually brought Chamberlain's mom a Christmas gift. So that just lets you know that it was a rivalry on the court that a lot of people in the press, especially nowadays, would try to pit them against each other, both on the court and off. But in that case, they refused to let that happen, and they were like really good friends off the court. And of course, Russell spoke at Chamberlain's funeral with a very touching and eulogy. If you haven't had a chance to see it, go check it out. It's a very moving speech. He does about Chamberlain when Chamberlain passes away. I think it was in 98 or 99 when he passed.
Late 90s. I remember when it happened. And,
it was like one of those, and it gives you an understanding of the level of the humanity, of Bill Russell. Not only he was a great basketball player, later he was also a civil rights activist, but he was also a really learned, very gracious and, very nice man. Even though he didn't give out autographs, that was just part of his deal, but he was just a very, very kind man.
Yeah, and I want to get to those, actually both of those aspects, both him as a teammate as well as some of the obstacles that he faced, especially early in his career, especially in Boston. The one thing that I'll say sort of about him and Wilt, he always resented the idea. First of all, to me, there's no contest. Russell over Wilt every day of the week. If I have to choose, if I have to rank, which is a big part of what we do in these conversations, and everybody says, oh, they're different. And I've obviously, part of what we do as sports fans and as sports historians is we rank one over the other. And to me, it's Russell over Wilt every day of the week. And one of the reasons I say that is Wilt always kind of gets the knock. Well, Russell played with all these great players and Wilt didn't really have that. And to me, that's always seemed like bull because, yeah, Russell had Kuzi and Havlicek and the Joneses, and he had Satch Sanders later on and Billy Howell and all these guys. But Wilt played with West. He played with Baylor. He played with Billy Cunningham and Hal Greer. Early in his career, he played with Andrew's favorite, Tom Gola. It's not as if Chamberlain wasn't also surrounded by Hall of Famers. And I don't say this to knock Wilt, but I just think that Russell was the ultimate winner, not just because of who he was surrounded by. There was something else why he won all those championships and Wilt didn't. There was something special about Bill Russell. And I think a big part of it was the kind of teammate he was. There's not a teammate of Bill Russell. I'm sure maybe there's one guy somewhere at some point, but everybody from John Thompson, who another guy we talked about on an In Memoriam a couple years ago, who, later the coach of Georgetown, who played with Russell and later talked about how much he looked up for him. Obviously to the other black players on the team, he was somebody to look up for and somebody to stick up for them, I should say. But also even beyond that, John Havlicek told a story about how he was a young player and he said he needed electronics equipment, whatever that was in the 60s, stereo hi-fi, and Russell driving him around Boston, finding the best deal. And then when they found the equipment that Havlicek wanted, saying to the store owner who he had a relationship with, give this rookie a big deal. Reminds me a lot of Shaq in those ways. You hear about what a great teammate Shaq was, buying guys suits and everything when they came into the league. So unlike a Jordan or some of these other guys, never a conflict with the teammate. And then, obviously when you add the racial angle and the atmosphere at the time, it would have been a lot easier for him to have a conflict with a teammate just based on that. Never hear anything about that, just what a great teammate was. When he was named Sportsman of the Year, the Celtics trainer in 68 says, the big concern he has is for the Celtics. Nothing else really matters. That's why he seems so cold to the press and the fans. They're not Celtics. After we won the championship last year, he kicked everyone who wasn't a Celtic out of the dressing room just so they could spend a few minutes together. So he loved his teammates. He was a great teammate. The story of that 69 NBA Finals where I think they were not great that year. I think they were
they weren't.
They were the fourth seed, I think.
No, they weren't. I believe they were a fourth seed. They had to get through, I think they had to get through the Knicks in the final. Yeah. In the Eastern Final. I think they got through a young Bullets team with Wes Unseld and Earl Monroe. Yep. And then they took on an up and coming Knicks team, of course, with Walt Frazier and that whole bunch, Bill Bradley, Willis Reed. I mean, they beat them, they edged them in 7, and then they were supposed to be destroyed by the Lakers because the Lakers had this long brewing. They were just like chomping at the bit to get the Celtics to finally get their revenge after the Celtics had destroyed and beat them in all those years. And then they have Wilt Chamberlain on the team along with Baylor and West. And they were supposed to just beat up on the Celtics, who was the old Celtics. I mean, people were talking about them as in the past tense in 1969. But as it turned out, another Game 7 in the Forum, the brand new Forum. Of course, you heard the story about how the owner of the Lakers, Jack Kent Cooke, put out like an itinerary of what's going to happen when the Lakers beat the Celtics in Game 7.
I love this story.
And as the story goes, Sam Jones finds the note, brings it to Russell. He said, look at what they're doing. Look, they already have it planned out of like what's going to happen. The USC band's supposed to play Happy Days Are Here Again. Chick Hearn is going to interview Wilt Chamberlain, Jerry West, and Elgin Baylor at the end of the game. And they have these big balloons, these big netted balloons at the top in the rafters of the Forum. It's going to fall down when the Lakers win. And Russell goes back and said, there's a lot of things that's going on. But there's one thing that cannot happen. The Lakers cannot beat us. There's just something that's just not going to happen. The Lakers can't beat us. It's going to be awfully fun to watch them take those balloons out of the rafters one at a time. And sure enough, they did. I mean, everybody remembers that shot of, I think it was John Havlicek hit that shot where it hit it was Don Nelson.
Don Nelson, yep. Mm-hmm.
Don Nelson hits the shot, hits the front of the rim and goes straight up in the air and comes right back through the hoop. If you saw that as a Laker fan, if I was a Laker fan, which I'm really not. I can't stand the Lakers. But, my apologies to my boy, Rick Loayza. The ball goes straight up in the air, goes right through the hoop. And if I was a Laker fan, I would have turned the TV off and said, dude, we lost. We lost. But that was a typical Celtics, though. And to go back to his relationship with his teammates and how he would stick up for his teammates and how a great teammate. I think Red Auerbach was the one that really fostered that. Mm-hmm. Because he was a guy that was really hard on his players, but at the same time, he did a lot of that out of love and kept them in the league. And I think that Russell just kind of carried that over when he took over as coach in '66. He kind of carried that over, the relationship and that culture, what they call the Celtic culture, the Celtic life, carried that over to his coaching career. And that culture actually carried on all the way to Bird and McHale and in Paris during the 1980s. That Celtic tradition was more than just winning and more than just, collecting banners and dominating the NBA at the time. It was fostering friendships and fostering relationships and keeping guys that were in the league and becoming a family. And that all started with Auerbach and Russell.
Russell talks about, and I wasn't able to find verification of this, but I wasn't able to refute it either. But in one of the things I was reading, he talked about how the players would vote on MVP every year, and every year, or most years, he would get it over Wilt. And then finally, he decided that one year Wilt had some like astronomical scoring average, but they still gave the MVP to Russell. So the league took they gave it to the writers after that. They took it out of the players' hands and they gave it to the writers so that Wilt would start winning MVPs. The other thing, and we don't necessarily have to dwell on this because our goal here is to honor the man, not necessarily to talk about his darkest periods, but you can't sort of talk about him as a Celtic without just talking. He was, maybe we should even just leave it at this. He suffered some horrible, horrible mistreatment at the hands of Boston fans, probably throughout his career, but especially early on. There had been black players on the Celtics before. Auerbach was very much sort of a progressive minded owner in that way, going back even early 50s. But the fact that in addition to all of that, Jackie Robinson at least only got it from the other teams and the other fans. Russell got it from his own fans. So that's, right. I think the fact that he was able to persevere and do what he did and be, one of the 2 or 3 best players in NBA history, I think that's something that's also really very much worth noting.
Yeah, that's right. Boston has always had a very complicated dealing with race and racial issues, even for a city that's a northern city. Mm-hmm. They've always had a difficult time with race and racism and things of that nature. But Russell powered his way through it, and he became, and that was one of the reasons why when they retired his number, I think it was in 75 or something like that he refused to show up. Yeah. He didn't show up for his own jersey retirement ceremony. He refused to show up. And he had a very complicated relationship with the city of Boston. He's one of, if not the most beloved players you think about the Boston as a sports city. You have Brady, you have Ted Williams, you have Russell, you have Bobby Orr. That's like the Mount Rushmore of sports history right there in the city of Boston. We're talking about 4 all-time greats.
That, in fact, was the Mount Rushmore of Boston sports in episode 1 of the Hello Old Sports podcast back 2 years ago.
You notice I'm listening, right?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And those are the 4. I think that relationship definitely softened with him to the Boston fans through the years. And you could see him courtside, even in the Pierce Garnett years, you'd see him courtside at Celtic games. I think they might have even at one point, sometime in the, in the 20 teens or the 2000s, I think they might have redone that ceremony with him actually in attendance.
They actually did. They actually did redo that retirement ceremony, and it was very moving. I grew up a Celtic fan because I was a big Dennis Johnson fan growing up. Mm-hmm. And I watched it and became a Celtic fan early on, where most of my friends were Laker fans. Of course, being in Louisiana, we didn't have an NBA team, but we, he either gravitated to become Laker fans, and me being wanting to be different, went with the Celtics. And then plus, I remember watching Dennis Johnson when he was a member of the Sonics when the 79 finals, with Seattle. I became a Dennis Johnson fan and ultimately became a Celtic fan. Looking back at that ceremony, which they redid, was really, really phenomenal.
Absolutely. And he was a phenomenal man. And the NBA is honoring him by retiring his number throughout the league.
That's right.
They've already done it. So Bill Russell, great player, great man, somebody who we definitely was worth taking some time here to talk about. So Dana, thank you for joining us. We won't say goodbye because you'll be back with us one more time. So thanks for doing this.
Man, no problem, man. This is so much fun. Thank you for having me.
Glad to do it.
And that's where we thought it would be a good place to cut off the first half of our 2022 in memoriam with the great Bill Russell, one of the greatest figures and the biggest winners of 20th century American sports. We'll catch you next time for part 2, beginning with the great Vin Scully. Goodbye, old sports.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com. Hey there, sports history fan. This is Arnie Chapman, a.k.a. the Football History Dude, and I hope that you enjoyed this recent episode presented by the Sports History Network and were able to learn some good old-fashioned sports history knowledge nuggets. I started the Sports History Network back in 2020 with the mission to help podcasters find a community of like-minded sports history nerds, as well as helping aspiring podcasters to start their own shows. We have a little bit over 30 shows on the network right now covering all sorts of sports history, but as far as I'm concerned, we're just at the toothpick in the ocean moment, that can't even figure it out because there's so much more coming. We wanted to create the ultimate headquarters for sports yesteryear, starting with Podcast Network and our website, but we're going to continue to move into other mediums as well. And here's the cool part, because we want you to be part of our team. So if you're interested in starting your own podcast, or maybe being a guest on one of our shows, or who knows, maybe even writing an article for us over on the website. Seriously, all you got to do is reach out to us on the contact page over at sportshistorynetwork.com. You can be as technologically savvy as a Neanderthal tapping on a stone trying to figure out this whole hieroglyphics thing back in the day. Again, it doesn't matter, because even if you don't understand the whole podcast space, we have a production team that can pretty much help you out with doing everything. All you got to do, head over to sportshistorynetwork.com, head to the contact page, fill it out. That message goes right to me, and I'll reach out to you as soon as I can. But for now, dude, I'm through if you're through.